My son flew with his family to Europe for getting my 70th birthday. I had been preparing for this day for so long, but they never showed up. My son texted a picture from Paris with the message, "Old man, we flew away to get a break from you." I did not get angry. I just silently excluded them from my inheritance, and then the real adjustment began. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach a hard lesson to family members who took your sacrifice for granted. My name is Lawrence. I am 70 years old. My hands are heavily scarred from 40 years of loading freight pallets and managing massive logistics warehouses. I ignored the deep ache in my joints as I carefully carved the large prime rib resting on my kitchen island. I spent 8 entire hours preparing this meal. I selected the finest cuts of meat from the local butcher. I marinated the beef with a special blend of spices my late wife taught me to make. It was my 70th birthday. I wanted it to be perfect. I set the heavy mahogany dining table for 3 people. I placed the polished silver cutlery exactly where my wife used to put it for special occasions. I lit the tall white candles in the center of the table. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 8. I poured a glass of ice water for myself and waited in the silence of my large empty house. The grandfather clock struck 9. I stood up slowly and walked to the front window. I checked the street through the wooden blinds. The streetlights illuminated the empty pavement. My driveway remained completely bare. A cold, heavy knot formed in my stomach. Jordan always ran late. He ran late to his high school graduation ceremony. He ran late to his own mother's funeral 5 years ago. I always made excuses for him. I worked brutal night shifts at the warehouse to ensure he never had to lift a single heavy box in his life. I paid for his pristine college education in cash so he could sit in air-conditioned offices and wear expensive suits. He constantly claimed he was a self-made tech entrepreneur. I knew the absolute truth. I knew exactly how his business was funded. The clock struck 10. The prime rib sat completely cold on the expensive ceramic serving platter. The candle wax dripped onto the linen tablecloth. I picked up my smartphone and dialed Jordan's number. The phone rang twice and went straight to voicemail. I hung up immediately. I did not leave a message. I walked into the living room and sat heavily in my leather armchair. I opened my tablet to distract my mind. I clicked on the social media application. The screen loaded in a flash. I saw a photograph posted exactly 14 minutes ago by my daughter-in-law, Vanessa. She is a white woman who constantly complains that my home smells like old wood and cheap soap. She openly despises the traditional soul food I cook for family gatherings, claiming it does not fit her strict dietary lifestyle. In the photograph, Vanessa was wearing a designer silk dress. She held a crystal glass of expensive champagne. The Eiffel Tower glowed brightly in the night sky right behind her. Jordan stood right beside her wearing a tailored tuxedo and smiling broadly into the camera lens. They were in Paris. They had not mentioned a single word to me about an international trip. They had simply packed their designer luggage and vanished across the ocean on the exact day I turned 70. My phone buzzed sharply against the kitchen counter. The sudden vibrating noise broke the heavy silence of the house. I walked back into the kitchen and picked it up. It was a text message from Jordan. I swiped the screen to open the notification. The message read, "Old man, we flew away to get a break from you. Do not call my phone. Vanessa needs a stress-free vacation. We will talk next month." I read the harsh, cruel words twice. I did not throw the phone against the granite counter. I did not curse or shed a single tear. Anger is a loud, uncontrolled, and useless emotion. I prefer absolute, calculated silence. I placed the phone gently on the counter. I walked back to the dining room. I methodically blew out the candles. I picked up the heavy serving platter. I carried the expensive, untouched prime rib to the sink. I scraped the entire roast directly into the garbage disposal. I turned on the cold water and flipped the heavy switch. The machine roared to life and ground the expensive meat into nothing. I washed every single plate with absolute precision. I dried the silverware with a clean towel and put it back into the velvet-lined box. I turned off the kitchen lights. I walked down the dark hallway and entered my home office. I closed the solid oak door firmly behind me. I walked to the tall bookshelf covering the far wall. I shifted a row of thick encyclopedias to reveal a hidden digital keypad. I typed in my passcode and unlocked the heavy steel safe hidden inside the wall. I pulled out my secure business banking ledgers and physical account tokens. Jordan loved to tell his wealthy suburban friends that he built his software startup entirely from nothing. He was lying to everyone who would listen. His company faced total bankruptcy 5 years ago. I had quietly co-signed his primary business line of credit to save him from complete financial ruin and public humiliation. He firmly believed I only survived on a meager state pension. He constantly judged my faded denim jeans and my 10-year-old rusted truck. He did not know I sold my independent logistics company to a massive corporate conglomerate 10 years ago for $12 million. I kept the massive fortune completely hidden in secure high-yield investment portfolios. I wanted Jordan to build his own legacy. I wanted him to understand the true value of hard work and fiscal responsibility. I had failed entirely. I had created a monster of entitlement. I sat down at my large mahogany desk and opened my secure laptop. The harsh blue light of the monitor illuminated the dark room. I plugged in my security token and opened the bank's secure corporate portal. I navigated to the specific interface to check the current balance of the co-signed business account. I wanted to see if his struggling tech company was actually generating any real revenue to pay for these lavish European vacations. The loading wheel spun on the screen for a few seconds. The encrypted web page displayed the data in bright red numbers. My breath caught in my throat. I leaned closer to the monitor, gripping the edge of the desk. The high-limit business credit line was completely maxed out. I refreshed the web page to ensure there was no technical glitch or display error. The numbers remained exactly identical. Someone had completely drained $80,000 from the corporate account over the last 4 weeks. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. That account was directly tied to my personal Social Security number and my primary residential deed as collateral. If that money was not repaid, the bank would hold me entirely responsible. They would seize my assets to cover his reckless spending. Jordan had not just insulted me on my birthday, he had severely compromised my financial stability. I stared at the red numbers on the screen. The $80,000 was a massive liability. I needed to know exactly where every single cent went. I needed to trace the transactions before the bank flagged the account for default. I needed to move immediately. The bank interface timed out, leaving me staring at the black screen of my encrypted laptop. $80,000. The sum echoed in my mind not as a loss of wealth, but as a stark confirmation of profound betrayal. I re-entered my security credentials and initiated a hard trace on the outbound transactions. I navigated through layers of corporate banking data, bypassing the superficial summaries to access the raw ledger. I needed the exact origin of every withdrawal. I needed to see exactly how Jordan and Vanessa had weaponized my credit. The ledger populated the screen. The initial withdrawal occurred exactly 2 days after I mentioned my upcoming 70th birthday dinner to Jordan. He had smiled, promised he would not miss it, and then quietly initiated a massive capital transfer. The funds did not move into his struggling tech startup's operational account. Instead, the money bypassed the corporate structure entirely. It was funneled through a shell LLC directly into a private international checking account. I clicked on the account details. The primary account holder was Vanessa. The spending pattern was aggressive and utterly unapologetic. I watched the timestamps of the transactions align perfectly with Vanessa's carefully curated social media posts. The first major charge was $12,000 at a flagship luxury boutique in Milan. I remembered Vanessa complaining last month about the lack of high-end fashion available locally. She had used my money to buy the silk dress she wore in the photograph in front of the Eiffel Tower. The next transaction was an $8,000 debit to an exclusive alpine spa retreat. They were massaging away their non-existent stress using my stolen credit. The most damning charge was $20,000 paid directly to a premium international airline. They had purchased 2 first-class round-trip tickets to Paris. They had planned this escape meticulously. They booked the flights precisely to overlap with my birthday. They did not forget the date. They weaponized it. They actively robbed me to celebrate their deliberate absence from my life. Jordan always operated under the arrogant assumption that I was a simple man surviving on a fixed state pension. He constantly judged my faded denim work jeans and my 10-year-old rusted truck. He mocked my preference for quiet evenings over loud corporate networking events. He did not know that I sold my independent logistics company to a massive corporate conglomerate 10 years ago. The sale netted $12 million. I kept the massive fortune completely hidden in secure, high-yield investment portfolios. I wanted Jordan to build his own legacy. I wanted him to understand the true value of hard work, discipline, and fiscal responsibility. I had failed entirely. I had created a monster of entitlement fueled by my silence and exploited by his wife. I closed the laptop monitor with a sharp click. The data was saved to a secure physical drive. I had the financial proof of their theft, but I needed to understand their ultimate endgame. Jordan was reckless, but Vanessa was calculating. Draining an $80,000 credit line was a bold move that guaranteed severe legal consequences unless they possessed a strategy to neutralize me permanently. I stood up and walked down the hallway to the guest bedroom. Jordan used this room as a dumping ground for his extra mail. He used my address for his personal business correspondence to avoid Vanessa tracking his minor spending habits. It was a pathetic arrangement, but it provided me with an unobstructed view into his chaotic life. I turned on the desk lamp and sifted through the chaotic pile of unopened envelopes. There were final notices from local creditors threatening letters from unpaid independent contractors and dozens of ignored utility bills. Jordan's entire existence was a carefully constructed facade of wealth built entirely on aggressive debt. I reached the bottom of the pile and found a thick manila envelope. It bore the embossed seal of a prominent local medical clinic. The return address belonged to a Dr. Aris, a physician I had never met or consulted. I tore the envelope open. The thick, high-quality paper felt heavy in my scarred hands. It was a copy of a preliminary psychiatric evaluation request. The patient listed was Lawrence Vance. The requesting party was Jordan Vance. I read the document with a cold, rising fury. The paperwork detailed fabricated claims about my memory and cognitive function. It stated I was suffering from severe undiagnosed dementia. It claimed I frequently left the stove on, forgot the names of my family members, and wandered the neighborhood at night. The document stated I was becoming a severe danger to myself and others. The final page outlined the necessary legal steps to grant Jordan emergency medical guardianship over me. The plan was terrifyingly clear. They were not merely stealing my credit. They were actively laying the legal groundwork to declare me mentally incompetent. Once Jordan secured medical guardianship, he would gain absolute unquestioned control over all my assets. They wanted to seize my house, liquidate my perceived savings, and throw me into a locked medical facility. They intended to erase my autonomy entirely to fund their lavish lifestyle. The sun began to rise, casting long shadows across the guest bedroom. I did not feel the physical exhaustion of a sleepless night. I felt a cold, calculated clarity. The situation had escalated from financial theft to an existential threat. They believed I was a weak, oblivious old man who could be easily discarded. They were catastrophically wrong. I picked up my smartphone and dialed a number I had not called in 6 years. The phone rang twice. Attorney Gallagher answered. His voice was sharp and professional, completely awake despite the early hour. I did not offer pleasantries. I told him to cancel his entire morning schedule. I informed him I was coming to his office immediately to completely rewrite my last will and testament and aggressively restructure my entire financial existence. The silent adjustment had officially begun. I parked my restored 1970 Chevrolet pickup truck in the underground parking garage of the downtown financial district. The polished concrete echoed with the low rumble of the heavy engine. I took the express elevator directly to the 42nd floor. Attorney Gallagher was waiting for me at the heavy glass doors of his firm. He wore a sharp navy suit. He did not offer a polite smile. He knew the cold tone of my voice on the phone meant absolute business. We walked straight into his corner office overlooking the sprawling city skyline. I did not sit down immediately. I tossed the thick stack of printed bank statements and the crumpled psychiatric evaluation request onto his pristine glass desk. Gallagher picked up the medical document first. I watched his eyes scan the false claims Jordan had submitted to the clinic. I saw his jaw tighten in genuine anger. Gallagher had been my primary corporate attorney for 30 years. We met in the late 1980s when I was fighting aggressive redlining tactics to secure city logistics contracts for my independent freight company. He knew my mind was sharper than men half my age. He knew my memory was absolutely flawless. He threw the document down on the desk with a sharp smack. He immediately offered to contact the district attorney to file criminal fraud charges against Jordan and Vanessa. He wanted to have them arrested in cuffs the very moment their return flight from Paris touched American soil. I raised my scarred right hand and stopped him. Arresting them now would give them adequate time to build a legal defense. It would allow Vanessa to play the innocent victim to her wealthy family. I wanted to dismantle their entire foundation first. I sat down in the leather chair opposite his desk. I instructed him to draw up the paperwork to completely revoke Jordan's medical power of attorney. I had granted him that authority 5 years ago when I underwent minor knee surgery. It was a standard precaution. Jordan was now attempting to weaponize it to lock me away. I ordered Gallagher to transfer all my medical and legal directives to an independent neutral fiduciary firm. If Jordan brought a corrupt doctor to my house to declare me incompetent, that doctor would face an immediate federal lawsuit from a relentless corporate legal team. Gallagher typed rapidly, generating the revocation forms. I signed them immediately with a steady hand. The medical shield was firmly in place. We then moved to the financial eradication. Jordan always assumed my trucking business had barely survived the economic downturns. He firmly believed I lived entirely off a standard fixed state pension. He had absolutely no idea that a massive international conglomerate had purchased my logistics network a decade ago. That corporate sale had netted me exactly $12 million. I had parked the entire fortune in aggressive high-yield investment portfolios. I wanted Jordan to struggle. I wanted him to learn how to build an empire with his own bare hands, just as I had done when I laid the first concrete blocks of my warehouse. Instead, he had married a woman who demanded endless luxury without labor, and he had resorted to stealing from his own father to fund her delusions. I commanded Gallagher to liquidate the entire $12 million portfolio. The stock market had just opened for the day. We initiated massive block sell orders. The vast capital flowed into a secure holding account within minutes. I told Gallagher to draft an irrevocable blind trust. Once the money entered this trust, I would permanently relinquish my direct legal ownership over the capital. The funds would be managed by a strict board of corporate trustees. Even if Jordan successfully bribed a psychiatrist to declare me senile, he would gain access to absolutely nothing. A medical guardian cannot seize assets held within an irrevocable blind trust. The money would be completely legally untouchable. Gallagher asked me to name the final beneficiaries of the trust. I did not hesitate for a single second. I formally and permanently disinherited my son. Jordan would not receive a single red cent from my estate. I instructed Gallagher to designate a specialized scholarship fund as the sole beneficiary. The massive fund would provide full university tuition for underprivileged African American youth seeking advanced degrees in engineering and logistics. I named the trust after my late wife. She had always valued education above everything else. She had explicitly warned me years ago that Jordan was adopting Vanessa's extreme entitlement. She told me I was spoiling him by paying off his early credit card debts. I had ignored her warnings to keep the peace in the family. I was now correcting my failure with absolute finality. Gallagher printed the massive stack of complex trust documents. I initialed every single page. I signed my full legal name on the binding declarations. The firm's notary public entered the office, stamped the documents, and exited in complete silence. The $12 million vanished from my personal name. My financial existence was completely restructured. I was now technically a man with a modest checking account and a small pension. I was exactly the poor old man Jordan arrogantly believed me to be. The difference was that I now held the absolute power to destroy his false reality. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair and drank a glass of cold water. I felt a profound sense of relief. The heavy burden of a toxic legacy was gone. I told Gallagher to proceed with the next phase of the operation. We needed to freeze the compromised business credit line that Vanessa had drained for her luxurious Parisian vacation. I authorized Gallagher to report the corporate cards as stolen and flag every single transaction in Europe as fraudulent. The bank's security algorithms would immediately lock Jordan and Vanessa out of their 5-star hotel and cancel their return flights. They would be stranded in a foreign country with zero access to capital. To fully secure the perimeter of my remaining assets, Gallagher needed to run a comprehensive sweep of my social security number and my corporate tax identification number. We had to ensure Jordan had not secretly attached my name to any other hidden liabilities. Gallagher opened a specialized terminal connected directly to the major credit bureaus and commercial lending databases. He entered my credentials and initiated the global search. The office fell completely silent. The only sound was the low hum of the air conditioning vent above us. I watched Gallagher's face as the data populated on his high-resolution monitor. His professional composure cracked violently. He stopped typing abruptly. He took his hands off the keyboard and leaned closer to the screen. His eyes darted back and forth across the lines of digital text. He let out a sharp, heavy breath. He slowly reached out and turned the large monitor toward me. I leaned forward and examined the screen. My heart hammered aggressively against my ribs. I did not see a simple credit card balance. I saw a massive active commercial real estate loan. The principal amount was $2.5 million. The staggering loan was registered to a holding company I did not recognize. I looked directly at the guarantor signatures on the digital file. Jordan had used my stolen corporate credentials and forged my signature to secure a multi-million-dollar commercial property for his failing tech startup. He had pledged my original fully paid-off warehouse district property as the primary collateral for the massive loan. Gallagher pointed a shaking finger to a flashing red alert at the very top of the ledger. Jordan had not just forged my name to secure capital, he had completely defaulted on the rigid repayment schedule. The commercial loan was 4 months in arrears. The bank had already initiated aggressive foreclosure proceedings. They were preparing to seize my historic warehouse property by the end of the week. Jordan had smiled in my face and promised to attend my 70th birthday dinner while fully knowing the bank was about to strip away the very foundation of my life's work. The silence in the office was absolute. I stared at the high-resolution monitor, my eyes tracing the forged signature at the bottom of the digital contract. Jordan had perfectly mimicked the looping curve of my capital letters. He had copied the exact aggressive slant I used when signing manifest logs on the loading dock 40 years ago. He had practiced this forgery. He had studied my handwriting with the sole intention of stealing my life's work. The warehouse district property was not just a piece of commercial real estate. It was the physical manifestation of my entire existence. I bought that dirt lot in 1982 when the banks refused to lend money to a black man wanting to start a freight company. I poured the concrete foundation with my own 2 hands. I laid the heavy steel beams while my joints screamed in agonizing pain. Jordan had taken that sacred legacy and offered it to a corporate bank to fund a failing tech startup that produced absolutely nothing of value. Gallagher tapped his keyboard, pulling up the extensive addendums of the commercial loan agreement. His face was pale. The severity of the federal crime was undeniable. Jordan had utilized my stolen corporate tax identification number alongside a fraudulent power of attorney document. He had bribed or manipulated a corrupt notary public to stamp the paperwork. The total principal was $2.5 million. Jordan had missed the last 4 monthly payments. The penalty fees and compounding interest were accumulating daily. The bank had issued the final notice of default 48 hours ago. They were legally positioned to seize my historic warehouse by Friday morning. They would auction it off for a fraction of its true value to satisfy the massive debt. Jordan was currently drinking expensive champagne in Paris while the bank prepared to lock the heavy iron gates of my legacy. I asked Gallagher to explain the specific collateral structure of the forged loan. The attorney enlarged a complex legal schematic on his screen. Jordan had structured the debt using a highly specific cross-collateralization method. He had pledged my warehouse as the primary unconditional guarantor of the funds. However, to satisfy the massive loan-to-value ratio demanded by the commercial lenders, Jordan had also pledged his own primary residence as secondary collateral. He and Vanessa lived in a massive, sprawling 5-bedroom mansion in an exclusive gated suburb. Vanessa constantly flaunted the pristine marble kitchen and the heated infinity pool on her social media accounts. She hosted extravagant dinner parties to impress her wealthy friends, pretending she and Jordan had earned every single luxury. They were living in a mansion mortgaged entirely against my stolen sweat and blood. Gallagher leaned across his glass desk. He urged me to contact the Federal Bureau of Investigation immediately. He explained that a formal federal indictment for wire fraud and severe identity theft would legally halt the bank's foreclosure proceedings. I raised my hand and demanded absolute silence. I refused his specific legal advice. A federal criminal investigation would take months, possibly years, to conclude. My historic warehouse property would be locked in an indefinite legal purgatory. The asset would be completely frozen as material evidence in a massive federal fraud trial. I would lose absolute control over my own property. I do not surrender control to government bureaucrats. I demanded an alternative financial strategy. I needed a surgical strike that would instantly sever the bank's claim on my warehouse while simultaneously crushing Jordan. Gallagher understood my absolute resolve. He began frantically scanning the dense fine print of the commercial lending agreement. He searched for a specific legal loophole. 10 minutes passed in agonizing silence. The digital clock on his desk shifted to 10:30 in the morning. Finally, Gallagher exhaled sharply. He highlighted a dense paragraph buried deep within the guarantor obligations section. It was a standard subrogation and indemnity clause. Gallagher explained the specific mechanics of the legal trap. Because my warehouse was listed as the primary unconditional guarantor, I possessed the legal right to cure the total default directly. If I paid the bank the entire outstanding arrears and settled the remaining principal in full, the bank would be fully satisfied. They would immediately release the aggressive lien on my warehouse. More importantly, the subrogation clause dictated that by curing the massive debt, I would legally assume the bank's exact position. I would become the primary lien holder against the secondary collateral. By paying off the forged loan, I would legally seize absolute ownership of Jordan and Vanessa's sprawling suburban mansion. The deed would transfer entirely to my name. I would not need to file a single police report to take their home. I would accomplish it through flawless, merciless corporate contract law. I did not hesitate for a single second. I instructed Gallagher to execute the maneuver immediately. I pulled my secure digital banking token from my jacket pocket. The newly established irrevocable blind trust was heavily funded, but I still maintained a massive private liquid cash reserve in a secondary offshore account specifically designed for aggressive corporate acquisitions. I authorized Gallagher to draft the emergency wire transfer. The total amount required to completely cure the default and satisfy the principal was $2,612,000. It was a staggering sum of money. It was the exact price of my absolute vengeance. Gallagher inputted the precise routing numbers. I typed my complex authorization sequence into the encrypted terminal. I pressed the execution key. The heavy silence in the office returned as we waited for the International Clearinghouse to process the massive transaction. I watched the status bar on Gallagher's monitor. 5 minutes felt like an absolute eternity. Then the screen flashed a brilliant green confirmation code. The wire transfer was completely successful. The commercial bank accepted the massive payment. The aggressive foreclosure proceedings against my historic warehouse were instantly and permanently canceled. My legacy was absolutely secure. Gallagher immediately initiated the secondary legal mechanism. He transmitted the certified subrogation documents directly to the county registrar. He filed the executed indemnity clauses. Within 45 minutes, the legal transfer was absolute. The massive suburban mansion with its pristine marble kitchen and heated infinity pool no longer belonged to Jordan and Vanessa. The property deed was officially registered under my exclusive corporate holding company. I owned every single square inch of their extravagant, deceitful life. They were currently arrogant tourists in Paris with absolutely no home to return to. I stood up from the heavy leather chair. I adjusted the tailored cuffs of my jacket. I looked down at Gallagher. He was staring at me with a mixture of profound professional respect and absolute terror. He had never witnessed a client execute such a flawless, devastating financial strike. I instructed him to contact his most aggressive, highly connected commercial real estate broker immediately. I wanted the suburban mansion listed on the private market within the hour. I demanded an immediate cash sale. I instructed Gallagher to list the sprawling property at 30% below the current market value to guarantee an instant corporate buyer. I wanted the transaction finalized and the legal paperwork completely executed before my son and his wife landed back on American soil. The trap was permanently set. I now needed a fast, ruthless crew to erase their physical existence from my new property. The call from Attorney Gallagher came exactly 3 hours after the property listing went live. I was sitting in the cab of my Chevrolet pickup truck watching the rain wash over the downtown pavement. Gallagher spoke quickly. His commercial real estate broker had secured a corporate buyer. It was a private equity firm looking to acquire large suburban lots for immediate redevelopment. They agreed to the deeply discounted cash price without a single counteroffer. They had the liquid capital ready to wire by the end of the business day. However, their aggressive timeline came with one absolute non-negotiable contingency. The mansion had to be completely vacated, stripped of all personal property, and turned over within 48 hours. The developers wanted to begin demolition preparation by Monday morning. I told Gallagher to accept the terms and finalize the contract immediately. I turned the ignition key. The heavy engine roared to life. I drove straight toward the exclusive gated community where my son resided. The security guard at the front gate initially refused me entry. He looked at my faded work jacket and my old truck with clear suspicion. He stated that Jordan and Vanessa Vance were out of the country and were not accepting visitors. I did not argue with the young man. I simply handed him the freshly certified property deed and my driver's license. I informed him that I was the sole legal owner of the property and he was currently blocking my lawful access. The guard reviewed the heavy legal seal on the document. His arrogant posture evaporated instantly. He pressed the button to open the heavy iron gates. I parked my truck in the sweeping circular driveway of the sprawling 5-bedroom mansion. I did not possess a physical key. I did not need one. I walked to the heavy oak front door and utilized the smart lock keypad. Jordan had always used his late mother's birth year as his primary security code. He lacked imagination. The digital lock clicked open on my first attempt. I pushed the door open and stepped into the massive foyer. The silence of the house was absolute. The air smelled of expensive vanilla diffusers and the sharp tang of fresh paint. I walked slowly through the rooms. Every single item in the house was a monument to their severe entitlement. I saw imported Italian leather sofas that cost more than a standard luxury vehicle. I saw massive custom-framed portraits of Vanessa posing on yachts. I walked into the master suite and opened the doors to the walk-in closet. The space was the size of a small apartment. It was overflowing with rows of designer shoes, silk dresses, and pristine tailored suits. Every single luxury brand logo represented a direct theft from my hidden accounts. Jordan had leveraged his entire future and my financial legacy to construct this fragile glass castle. I felt no hesitation. I felt no parental guilt. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed Marcus. Marcus was the former foreman of my main logistics warehouse. He currently ran an independent commercial liquidation and freight crew. He was a man who understood strict deadlines and absolute discretion. I told Marcus I needed a full extraction crew and 2 20-foot box trucks at my location within the hour. I informed him I was paying triple his standard commercial rate for immediate priority service. Marcus did not ask unnecessary questions. He simply asked for the address. While I waited for the crew, I secured the destination for their belongings. I used my tablet to rent a large commercial storage unit on the far industrial edge of the city. I intentionally chose a facility that was entirely bare bones. It was a windowless concrete unit secured by a heavy rolling steel door. It had absolutely no climate control. It lacked the polished security gates of the premium storage facilities. I paid the first month of rent in cash and secured a standard heavy padlock. It was the exact physical environment their fake luxury truly deserved. Marcus and his crew arrived 45 minutes later. 5 broad-shouldered men carrying heavy moving dollies and thick rolls of industrial packing tape stepped into the pristine foyer. Marcus looked around the opulent mansion and then looked directly at me. I gave him a very simple, ruthless directive. I instructed the crew to pack every single personal item in the house. They were not required to sort, organize, or gently handle the belongings. I told them to sweep the closets, empty the heavy drawers, and clear the imported furniture as fast as humanly possible. I wanted the house stripped completely down to the bare drywall and the hardwood floors. The extraction was a masterpiece of organized chaos. The crew moved with the relentless efficiency of an industrial assembly line. They threw Vanessa's thousands of dollars of designer clothing into heavy cardboard freight boxes. They dumped Jordan's expensive technology gaming consoles and custom suits into huge plastic bins. They dismantled the massive Italian leather sofas and wrapped them in cheap protective plastic. The pristine illusion of my son's wealthy lifestyle was dismantled piece by piece and shoved into the back of 2 dirty commercial box trucks. I stood in the center of the living room and watched the erasure happen in real time. In less than 6 hours, the massive 5-bedroom mansion was completely void of life. It echoed with the hollow sound of empty space. I directed Marcus to drive the trucks to the industrial storage facility. I followed closely behind in my Chevrolet. We unloaded the heavy boxes into the concrete unit. The men stacked the designer shoes and the expensive electronics carelessly against the cold cinder block walls. When the final box was pushed inside, I pulled the rolling steel door down. The heavy metal slammed against the concrete floor. I secured the thick padlock and pocketed the single silver key. I paid Marcus in cash, shook his hand, and watched the box trucks drive away. The physical erasure of Jordan and Vanessa's life was completely finished. The corporate buyer wired the massive cash payment for the empty mansion into my secure holding account exactly 2 hours later. The property transaction was legally closed. At that exact moment, across the Atlantic Ocean, the evening lights of Paris were shining brightly. Jordan and Vanessa were sitting at a highly exclusive Michelin-starred restaurant near the Champs-Élysées. Vanessa had ordered vintage champagne and imported caviar. They had just finished a meal that cost more than a standard monthly mortgage payment. The impeccably dressed waiter approached their candlelit table. He presented the heavy leather billfold with a polite, practiced smile. Jordan casually placed the stolen corporate credit card onto the silver tray. He continued laughing at a joke Vanessa was telling. The waiter walked away to process the transaction. 5 minutes passed. The waiter returned. His polite smile was completely gone. His expression was tight and highly uncomfortable. He informed Jordan that the primary credit card had been immediately declined. Jordan scoffed arrogantly. He blamed a fraud protection glitch. He pulled out a secondary platinum card from his leather wallet. The waiter ran the second card. The digital machine beeped loudly, signaling another absolute rejection. Vanessa stopped smiling. She watched the waiter shake his head. Jordan felt a sudden cold spike of panic. He quickly pulled out his phone and opened his mobile banking application. The screen loaded. His personal accounts were entirely frozen. A stark red banner across his screen indicated a severe security lock due to suspicious international activity. The bank had severed his financial access completely. The waiter stood firmly at the table demanding immediate payment. Jordan's hands began to shake violently. He stared at the frozen screen. He had absolutely no cash. He had no functioning credit. He was thousands of miles away from home. He desperately opened his contacts and hit the call button for my number. My phone began to buzz loudly in the dark cab of my truck. The digital screen illuminated, displaying Jordan's name. The panic had officially set in. The digital screen of my smartphone illuminated the dark interior of my Chevrolet. The aggressive vibration rattled the device against the plastic center console. The caller identification displayed my son's name in bright white letters. I did not reach for the phone. I leaned back into the heavy fabric of the driver's seat and watched the cold rain streak across the windshield. The ringing stopped and immediately started again. Jordan was frantic. His carefully manufactured reality had just shattered on the marble floor of a Parisian restaurant. I let the phone ring a third time before the system routed him directly to voicemail. I pressed the screen to listen to the audio recording. Jordan's voice echoed loudly through the truck speakers. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not offer a single word of apology for missing my 70th birthday dinner. He demanded absolute and immediate compliance. He told me his corporate credit cards were malfunctioning and instructed me to wire $20,000 to his personal checking account within the hour. He claimed the bank had made a massive administrative error and he needed liquid cash to cover a vital business dinner with European investors. He was lying. He was drowning in his own fabricated wealth. The phone buzzed a fourth time. I reached down and pressed the red physical button. I declined the call. I powered the device down completely and slipped it into the deep pocket of my heavy canvas coat. The silence inside the truck was perfect. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked back across the sweeping circular driveway. The heavy rain quickly washed away the muddy tire tracks left by the commercial moving trucks. I approached the massive oak front door of the suburban mansion. The digital smart lock was still active under my temporary administrative control. I pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside. The sprawling 5-bedroom house was completely unrecognizable. Marcus and his liquidation crew had operated with absolute surgical precision. The imported Italian leather sofas were gone. The expensive custom oil paintings were removed from the walls. The massive crystal vases and thick silk rugs were completely erased from existence. The house was nothing but bare drywall and highly polished hardwood floors. My heavy work boots echoed loudly in the cavernous space. I walked into the pristine marble kitchen. Vanessa had spent $100,000 renovating this specific room, using the commercial real estate loan Jordan had forged in my name. She had demanded imported marble countertops and custom brass fixtures to impress her wealthy social circle. All her expensive espresso machines and imported wine coolers were now sitting in a damp concrete storage unit on the industrial side of the city. I stood perfectly still at the center of the massive marble island. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the single silver padlock key for the commercial storage unit. I placed the cold metal key directly in the center of the kitchen counter. I reached into my other pocket and produced 2 neatly folded pieces of paper. The first document was the prepaid commercial storage receipt detailing the exact location of their discarded belongings. The second document was a printed screenshot of the exact text message Jordan had sent me on the night of my birthday. The words boldly stated that he needed a break from me and that we would speak next month. I laid both papers neatly next to the silver key. There would be absolutely no confusion when they finally managed to arrive. I walked out the front door and pulled it firmly shut. I used my tablet to execute a complete factory reset on the smart lock system. The heavy steel deadbolt engaged with a loud final click. I transferred the digital security credentials entirely to the corporate buyer. My physical connection to the property was permanently severed. Across the ocean, the reality of absolute poverty was rapidly closing in on my son. Without my corporate credit line acting as his financial shield, Jordan possessed absolutely zero liquid capital. He had spent his entire adult life building a fragile illusion of technological wealth. He leased expensive European sports cars and purchased bespoke, tailored suits to convince venture capitalists he was a highly successful entrepreneur. He married a woman who demanded a lifestyle he could never legitimately afford. I knew exactly how the humiliating scene in Paris was playing out. The arrogant restaurant manager would demand immediate payment for the expensive champagne and caviar. Jordan would attempt to use his personal debit cards, only to find them completely frozen by the International Fraud Department. The bank had locked his entire financial existence the exact moment Attorney Gallagher reported the forged commercial loan. Vanessa would stand on the wet Parisian sidewalk in her stolen silk dress, furious and completely humiliated. She had married Jordan solely because she believed he possessed unlimited access to a massive self-made fortune. She believed she had secured a permanent blank check. Her entire worldview was currently collapsing. Jordan had no cash to pay for their luxury hotel suite. He had no funds to rebook their flights. He was utterly stranded. Jordan was left with only one viable option to escape the foreign country. He could not rely on his supposed business partners, as they were merely sycophants drawn to his fake corporate spending. He could not call his own father because my phone was permanently deactivated. He was forced to turn to the one man who had always fundamentally despised him. Vanessa's father was a wealthy, old-money real estate developer from a deeply conservative and prejudiced family. He was a ruthless, condescending man who had vehemently opposed his daughter marrying an African-American man. He had openly mocked Jordan's tech startup at their engagement dinner, calling him an ambitious fraud who lacked genuine financial pedigree. Jordan had spent the last 5 years desperately trying to prove his father-in-law wrong. He had forged my signature on a massive commercial loan specifically to demonstrate his financial equality to Vanessa's elitist family. He wanted to prove he belonged in their exclusive circles. Now entirely stripped of my stolen wealth, Jordan had to make the most humiliating phone call of his entire life. He had to dial his racist father-in-law from a public Parisian sidewalk. He had to admit his complete financial ruin. He had to desperately beg for 2 economy-class plane tickets back to America. He would have to listen to the older man sneer through the phone receiver, confirming every terrible stereotype he had ever held about my son. Jordan would be forced to swallow his extreme pride and accept the devastating reality that he was completely dependent on the charity of a man who hated him. He would have to explain to Vanessa why his massive tech fortune had suddenly vanished into thin air. He would have to watch the love and respect drain from his wife's eyes as she realized she was married to a broke, desperate criminal. The trap had closed with absolute perfection, and the resulting humiliation was exactly what my son deserved. The cold silence of my deactivated phone was the loudest lesson I had ever taught him. They were coming home to a life they never prepared for. I parked my Chevrolet pickup truck half a block away from the sprawling suburban mansion. The heavy rain from 2 days ago had given way to a bitter, biting cold. I rolled down the window just enough to hear the street noise. I checked the gold face of my wristwatch. It was exactly 2 in the afternoon. Attorney Gallagher had informed me that the corporate buyers took physical possession of the property at 9 this morning. The site manager was currently inside the house measuring the bare walls for a massive upcoming demolition. A bruised and dirty economy rideshare vehicle turned onto the pristine suburban street. It slowed down and pulled into the circular driveway. The contrast was utterly pathetic. Jordan and Vanessa were accustomed to arriving in private black cars. Now they were stepping out of a vehicle smelling of stale smoke. They dragged their minimal carry-on bags across the pavement. Their heavy designer luggage was completely missing. I knew exactly why. Vanessa's father, a man who despised my son, had refused to pay the excess baggage fees for their European suitcases. He had purchased them the cheapest, most restrictive economy tickets available on a budget airline. He had forced them to abandon their luxury purchases in Paris. Jordan slammed the car door shut. He looked completely exhausted. His expensive suit was wrinkled. His posture was slumped. Vanessa walked 3 steps ahead of him. She marched toward the front door with aggressive entitlement. She did not notice the subtle changes to the property. She did not notice the small, discreet signs of a recent corporate transfer. She reached the heavy oak door and waited for Jordan to open it. Jordan pulled his keys from his pocket. He inserted the primary house key into the deadbolt. It did not turn. He pulled it out and inspected the metal teeth, assuming he had used the wrong key. He tried again. The lock remained completely rigid. I watched from the cab of my truck as frustration twisted his features. He muttered something to Vanessa. She threw her hands up in the air, clearly snapping at him for his incompetence. Jordan reached for the digital smart keypad. He punched in his late mother's birth year. The screen blinked a harsh, solid red light. An error tone echoed across the quiet porch. He typed the code a second time, pressing his fingers aggressively against the glass screen. The red light flashed again. The system locked him out entirely. Vanessa pushed him aside. She slammed her hand against the heavy wooden door, demanding entry into a house she believed she rightfully owned. The heavy deadbolt clicked loudly from the inside. The door swung inward. Jordan and Vanessa stepped forward, expecting to find a confused domestic worker or a rogue security guard. Instead, they came face to face with a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a hard hat and a high-visibility corporate vest. He held a digital clipboard in his left hand. This was the site manager for the private equity firm. He did not look friendly. He looked like a man whose rigid construction schedule had just been interrupted by two random trespassers. Vanessa demanded to know what he was doing in her house. She ordered him to leave the premises immediately. She threatened to call the local police. The site manager stared at her with complete apathy. He did not raise his voice. He tapped the screen of his digital clipboard and asked for their legal names. Jordan stepped forward, puffing his chest out in a pathetic display of authority. He stated his name loudly. He declared that he held the deed to the property and demanded the man vacate the foyer. The site manager shook his head. He calmly informed Jordan that the property was legally purchased in a cash transaction 48 hours ago. He stated that the deed was currently registered to a commercial redevelopment firm. He turned the digital clipboard around and showed Jordan the certified county records. I watched Jordan's face drain of all color. He stared at the glowing screen. He recognized the specific legal jargon. He saw the official subrogation clauses. He saw the exact amount of his forged commercial loan listed as completely cured by a secondary corporate entity. The bank had executed a flawless foreclosure and immediate asset transfer. Jordan realized he had absolutely zero legal claim to the property. He realized the bank had discovered his massive default and seized his collateral while he was drinking champagne in France. Vanessa did not understand commercial real estate law. She did not care about subrogation clauses. She screamed that there was a massive mistake. She tried to push past the site manager to enter the foyer. The man stepped firmly into the doorway, blocking her path with his massive frame. He pointed a thick finger directly at her chest. He warned her that she was standing on private corporate property. He stated that if she took one more step inside, he would immediately call the police and have them both arrested for criminal trespassing. Jordan grabbed Vanessa's arm. He tried to pull her back down the porch steps. He knew the site manager was completely serious. He knew the police would immediately verify the corporate deed. He knew a public arrest would draw attention to his forged commercial loan. He was a coward retreating from a battle he had already mathematically lost. Vanessa fought against his grip. She demanded to know where her furniture was. She screamed about her imported marble countertops and her custom silk rugs. The site manager coldly informed her that the previous owner had authorized a complete property extraction. He stated the house was entirely empty down to the bare floorboards. He slammed the heavy oak door shut. The lock engaged with a loud final click. They stood on the front porch in the freezing wind. The reality of their absolute ruin finally crashed down upon them. They had no home. They had no money. They possessed nothing but the wrinkled clothes on their backs. Vanessa turned violently toward Jordan. She unleashed a torrent of pure, unadulterated rage. Her voice carried clearly across the quiet suburban street. She screamed about her father. She screamed about the profound humiliation of begging him for a budget airline ticket. She screamed that Jordan was a pathetic fraud who had lied to her about his massive wealth. Jordan tried to silence her. He begged her to lower her voice. He looked nervously at the neighboring houses, terrified that his wealthy peers were watching his absolute public destruction. His fragile ego could not handle the exposure. He frantically tried to explain the bank subrogation process. He tried to blame a clerical error. He tried to blame the commercial lenders. Vanessa stopped screaming abruptly. She stared at Jordan with eyes wide in horrific realization. She possessed a sharp, ruthless intelligence when her personal comfort was threatened. She pieced the timeline together with absolute precision. She realized the bank would never execute a cash sale and a complete property extraction in exactly 48 hours without a highly motivated primary guarantor pulling the legal strings. She remembered the massive commercial loan Jordan had secured using my name. She remembered the cruel text message they had sent me from Paris. She pointed her finger aggressively at Jordan's chest. She stated that only one person possessed the capital, the legal standing, and the motivation to execute this specific maneuver. She stated my name. Jordan shook his head in frantic denial. He insisted I was just a poor old man living on a fixed state pension. He claimed I did not possess the financial resources to cure a multi-million-dollar commercial default. He was completely blinded by his own arrogant assumptions. He refused to believe I could outsmart him. Vanessa did not listen to his pathetic excuses. She grabbed him by the lapels of his wrinkled suit jacket. She pulled him close and delivered a furious absolute command. She ordered him to order another rideshare immediately. She demanded they drive directly to my estate. She wanted her expensive furniture back. She wanted her comfortable life restored. She believed she could intimidate me into reversing the legal process. She believed she could walk into my home and command my total obedience. I watched them stumble down the driveway to wait by the curb. The cold wind whipped against their light jackets. I rolled up the window of my Chevrolet. I put the truck into gear and drove slowly down the street, passing right behind them. They did not even notice my vehicle. They were entirely consumed by their panic and their rage. I smiled a cold, tight smile. The first phase of the structural collapse was completely successful. They were currently homeless, broke, and marching directly into my final trap. I pressed the accelerator and headed toward my estate. I needed to be waiting at the front gate when they arrived. The final confrontation was imminent, and I was holding every single card. I pulled my Chevrolet through the towering iron gates of my private estate. I reached up to the sun visor and pressed the remote transmitter. The heavy steel barriers glided shut behind me, sealing the perimeter of my property with a loud metallic clatter. I parked the truck in the detached garage and walked up the long cobblestone path to the front porch. The wind was howling aggressively, stripping the last dead leaves from the ancient oak trees that lined my driveway. I unlocked the solid mahogany front door and stepped into the warm, quiet interior of my home. I did not take off my heavy canvas coat. I did not sit down. I stood perfectly still in the center of the massive foyer, waiting for the inevitable arrival of the storm. 10 minutes later, the proximity alarm on my digital security panel chimed a sharp dual tone. The high-resolution exterior cameras displayed the same beaten rideshare vehicle idling outside my front gates. Jordan was standing in the freezing rain, furiously mashing the call button on the electronic intercom. I did not answer his frantic buzz. I simply pressed the release toggle on my wall panel. The iron gates slowly opened. I wanted them to walk the long, steep driveway up to my front door. I wanted them to feel the physical exhaustion of their absolute defeat. The security cameras tracked their miserable ascent. Vanessa was shivering violently in her thin designer jacket, her expensive high heels struggling and slipping against the wet, uneven cobblestone. They reached the expansive front porch. Jordan did not knock politely. He hammered his fists violently against the thick mahogany wood. He was frantic, driven by the absolute terror of a man who had just watched his entire fabricated universe evaporate into thin air. I let him pound on the door for exactly 60 seconds. I wanted him to exert his useless energy. I wanted the cold air to bite into his skin. I reached out and turned the heavy brass deadbolt. I pulled the door open and blocked the threshold with my physical presence. Jordan practically stumbled forward. His face was flushed red with anger and severe panic. Vanessa pushed past him, her eyes wide with unadulterated fury. She instantly launched into a hysterical, screeching tirade. She screamed that my real estate associates had illegally locked her out of her own house. She demanded that I immediately transfer the property deed back into Jordan's name. She shrieked about her imported Italian furniture, claiming I had authorized a criminal robbery and that she would see me thrown into prison. Jordan quickly echoed her aggressive demands. He shouted that his corporate bank accounts were frozen, his stellar credit was destroyed, and his business reputation was completely ruined. He demanded a massive wire transfer to fix the catastrophic damage I had allegedly caused. He genuinely believed he could still bully me into submission. He still thought I was the weak, compliant father he had successfully manipulated for the past decade. I did not raise my voice. I did not interrupt their pathetic display of severe entitlement. I stood there like a stone wall and let them exhaust their vocal cords until they were both breathing heavily in the freezing air. When absolute silence finally returned to the porch, I reached into the deep inner pocket of my coat. I pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. I held it out toward my son. Jordan looked at the package with deep suspicion, but his overwhelming greed forced his hand. He snatched the envelope from my grip and ripped the top seal open. I watched his eyes scan the first document. It was the commercial storage facility invoice. I spoke with a slow, deliberate, and icy cadence. I looked directly at Vanessa. I informed her that her priceless silk rugs, her custom espresso machines, and her massive wardrobe of designer shoes were currently sitting in an unheated windowless concrete box on the very edge of the city's industrial district. I explained that she had exactly 30 days to retrieve her precious belongings before the facility manager legally auctioned them off to the highest bidder for industrial scrap. I pulled the single silver padlock key from my pocket and dropped it directly onto the wet cobblestone at her feet. It landed with a sharp metallic clink. Vanessa stared at the small, cheap key as if it were a venomous snake. The reality of her new, completely impoverished existence was finally penetrating her thick skull. Jordan flipped frantically to the second set of documents in the envelope. His aggressive posture instantly shattered. His hands began to tremble violently. He was holding the high-resolution certified copies of the commercial real estate loan he had forged in my exact name. The documents clearly displayed the fraudulent notary seal and his pathetic attempt to replicate my signature. He flipped the heavy page and saw the official notice of severe default from the commercial lending bank. Finally, he saw the corporate indemnity clause that transferred absolute legal ownership of his suburban mansion directly to my private holding company. I had provided him with the complete architectural blueprint of his own destruction. I stepped forward, forcing Jordan to retreat backward onto the cold porch. I dismantled his entire reality with absolute ruthless precision. I told him he was a complete failure as a businessman and a fraud as a man. He had never built a successful company. He had simply constructed a fragile pyramid scheme using my stolen identity as the financial foundation. I explained that I had personally wired $2.6 million of liquid cash to cure his criminal default. I informed him that the federal wire fraud penalty for his specific actions carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years in a federal penitentiary. I made it absolutely clear that the only reason he was currently standing on my porch instead of sitting in a concrete holding cell was because I chose to seize his physical assets instead of calling the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Jordan could not speak. The breath was completely knocked out of his lungs. He realized I held his entire existence in the palm of my scarred right hand. If he fought the eviction, I would hand the forged loan documents directly to the district attorney. If he tried to sue me for the house, he would publicly incriminate himself in a massive federal felony. He was entirely trapped in a financial and legal cage of his own design. He looked at Vanessa, desperately hoping for support, but she was staring at the forged bank documents with absolute disgust. She realized Jordan was not a wealthy tech genius. He was a pathetic, broke criminal who had lost absolutely everything. I looked at both of them standing in the freezing wind. I felt no pity. I felt no parental obligation to rescue a thief. I told Jordan he was formally and permanently disinherited. I told him he was permanently banned from my property. I advised him to pick up the silver key from the mud and start walking toward the industrial district to find a cheap motel. I stepped back into the warmth of my massive foyer. I pulled the heavy mahogany door shut directly in their faces. The thick brass deadbolt engaged with a loud, absolute click. The physical barrier was permanently sealed. I walked away from the door feeling a profound sense of finality. The toxic burden of my son was gone. Suddenly, violent pounding erupted against the thick wood again. It was not Jordan, it was Vanessa. She was hammering her fists against the heavy doorframe, completely losing her mind. She shrieked through the thick timber, her voice cracking with pure venomous desperation. She screamed that she would not live in a concrete storage unit. She screamed that I had no right to take away the luxurious life she was promised. Then her threats turned deeply sinister. She shouted that I was clearly suffering from severe dementia. She screamed that she was going to contact the most aggressive psychiatrist in the city. She swore at the top of her lungs that she would arrive with a medical transport team by Monday morning to drag me out of my home and commit me to a locked psychiatric ward. She promised to seize absolute legal control over my mind and my money before the week was over. Vanessa's shrieks eventually faded into the howling wind as she and Jordan retreated down the long driveway. I remained standing in the massive, quiet foyer of my home. I did not underestimate her final threat. Her promise to commit me to a locked psychiatric ward was a desperate, vicious tactic born of pure panic. However, it possessed genuine legal danger. In this state, a convinced family member accompanied by a compliant, unethical physician could initiate an emergency 72-hour involuntary medical hold. If they successfully locked me inside a facility, Jordan would immediately file an emergency injunction to challenge the blind trust. He would argue to a sympathetic judge that I was suffering from severe cognitive decline when I transferred my massive liquid assets. He would attempt to invalidate the entire corporate maneuver. I had exactly 48 hours to render her weapon completely useless. I needed to forge an impenetrable medical shield. I walked directly to my private study and picked up the secure landline. I dialed Attorney Gallagher. He answered on the first ring despite the late hour. I relayed Vanessa's exact words with absolute precision. Gallagher's professional tone turned instantly severe. He understood the profound threat. He explained that a fraudulent medical guardian could temporarily freeze my accounts if they manufactured enough initial doubt about my sanity. We needed irrefutable preemptive proof of my absolute mental competence. We could not rely on a standard general practitioner. We needed a flawless board-certified defense. Gallagher bypassed the standard medical channels immediately. He contacted Dr. Eris Thorne, the chief of forensic psychiatry and neurology at the foremost private research hospital in the state. Dr. Thorne routinely evaluated high-net-worth individuals to secure their massive estates against hostile family takeovers. He was a man whose medical testimony was completely bulletproof in federal court. Gallagher authorized a massive emergency retainer fee. He scheduled a comprehensive cognitive and psychiatric battery for 6 o'clock Saturday morning. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my leather armchair and reviewed my extensive corporate ledgers. I needed my mind to be a sharpened blade. At 5 in the morning, I drove my Chevrolet through the dark, rain-slicked streets to the private medical facility. Dr. Thorne was waiting for me in a sterile, brightly lit examination room. He was accompanied by an independent clinical neuropsychologist and a licensed legal videographer. They were taking absolutely no chances. The entire grueling procedure would be recorded from 2 separate camera angles to guarantee total transparency. I sat down at the steel table facing the 2 specialists. The red recording lights illuminated. The cognitive defense began immediately. The examination was an exhaustive, relentless interrogation. They did not simply test my short-term memory or my spatial reasoning. They tested my executive function, my emotional regulation, and my complex analytical processing. They asked me to recall the exact dates and specific concrete materials I used to lay the foundation of my warehouse district property in 1982. I provided the precise inventory logs. They instructed me to count backward from 1,000 by intervals of 13, while simultaneously memorizing a shifting sequence of colored digital flashcards. I completed the task without breaking eye contact. Dr. Thorne shifted the evaluation to assess my financial comprehension. He wanted to ensure I fully understood the severe ramifications of disinheriting my only son. I did not simply confirm my understanding. I aggressively detailed the exact legal mechanics of the commercial loan subrogation clause I had utilized against Jordan. I recited the complex banking routing numbers from the overseas wire transfer entirely from memory. I explained the precise legal structure of the irrevocable blind trust and named every single corporate trustee on the board. I explicitly stated that my son was a hostile financial parasite and that my actions were calculated, punitive, and entirely rational. I expressed zero remorse. I demonstrated cold, absolute lucidity. The 2 doctors observed me with profound professional respect. They had expected to evaluate an elderly man under severe family distress. Instead, they were interviewing a ruthless corporate tactician operating at peak mental efficiency. After 4 agonizing hours, Dr. Thorne formally concluded the examination. He turned to the primary camera and delivered his binding medical verdict. He stated that I possessed the cognitive sharpness, memory retention, and executive processing speed of a highly functioning man half my age. He declared unequivocally that I was in complete and absolute command of my mental faculties. We moved immediately to the adjoining conference room. Gallagher was waiting with his firm's senior notary public. Dr. Thorne and the neuropsychologist drafted a massive comprehensive affidavit of absolute mental competency. The document explicitly stated that any future attempt to declare me mentally unfit would be a direct medical contradiction and a clear indicator of familial fraud. The doctor signed the heavy pages. The notary stamped the red seals. Gallagher took the certified documents and immediately initiated a ruthless legal firewall. He digitally filed the sworn medical affidavits directly with the county court registry. He submitted official copies to the local police precinct attaching a preemptive warning about my son's hostile intentions and Vanessa's explicit verbal threats. Finally, I signed a binding medical directive that completely revoked any remaining family input regarding my health care. I designated Gallagher's corporate firm as the sole legal entity authorized to make medical decisions on my behalf if I were ever genuinely incapacitated. The fortress was complete. Jordan and Vanessa could bring 100 corrupt doctors to my door. They would hit a solid wall of federal litigation. I drove back to my estate on Saturday afternoon. I felt a profound sense of physical and mental relief. The legal traps were set. The financial assets were secured. My mind was legally certified as an impenetrable vault. I spent Sunday morning brewing dark coffee and listening to the local financial news. The house was perfectly quiet. I knew Vanessa would not wait until Monday morning. Desperation breeds severe impatience. She needed control of my assets immediately to secure luxury housing and maintain her fraudulent social status. She would attempt to strike while she assumed I was resting. At exactly 2 o'clock on Sunday afternoon, the proximity alarm on my digital security panel triggered a sharp, piercing tone. I walked calmly to the foyer and activated the high-resolution exterior camera feed. A severely rusted, unmarked sedan was idling directly in front of my iron gates. It was not an official medical transport vehicle. It was not an ambulance. A man stepped out of the driver's side. He wore a wrinkled, ill-fitting suit and carried a heavily worn leather medical bag. He approached the intercom terminal. He possessed a shifting, nervous demeanor. He repeatedly checked his surroundings, avoiding looking directly into the primary security lens. He did not look like a legitimate psychiatric professional. He looked exactly like a hired mercenary. Vanessa had likely scoured the darkest corners of her wealthy father's dubious connections to find a disgraced physician willing to sign fraudulent emergency commitment papers for a direct cash bribe. He pressed the call button. The harsh buzzer echoed loudly through my quiet house. I did not speak through the intercom. I wanted to see the absolute terror on his face when he realized his target was not a confused old man. I turned the deadbolt on my mahogany door and stepped out onto the cold porch, staring straight down the long driveway at the hostile intruder standing at my gate. The man at the gate leaned heavily against the intercom pillar. I pressed the secondary release button on my pocket transmitter. The heavy iron gates swung inward with a low mechanical hum. The intruder did not walk up the steep cobblestone path. He hurried back into his rusted sedan and drove aggressively up the driveway, parking haphazardly over the edge of the manicured lawn. He was displaying deliberate disrespect. It was a classic intimidation tactic designed to rattle a vulnerable target. I remained standing on the threshold of my open mahogany door. The biting wind whipped across the porch, but I did not shiver. The man stepped out of his vehicle. He wore a cheap, poorly fitted gray suit that smelled faintly of stale tobacco and cheap mint cologne. He carried a scuffed leather briefcase. He walked up the steps and presented a laminated identification card hanging from a breakaway lanyard. He introduced himself as Dr. Julian Keller. He claimed he was a specialized geriatric psychiatrist contracted by Adult Protective Services at the urgent request of my immediate family. He stated he was here to conduct an emergency wellness evaluation. I knew immediately that he was entirely fraudulent. Adult Protective Services do not operate on Sunday afternoons using private contractors in unmarked, rusted vehicles. Furthermore, my legal team had already filed preemptive injunctions with every legitimate state agency. This man was a hired mercenary. He was a criminal masquerading as a medical professional. I did not point out these glaring discrepancies. I smiled politely and stepped aside. I extended my right arm and graciously invited him into my home. I wanted him entirely submerged within my security perimeter. My estate is equipped with a commercial-grade surveillance matrix. I installed it years ago to monitor expensive freight deliveries. High-definition lenses are seamlessly integrated into the crown molding of every room. Directional microphones are embedded in the central lighting fixtures. As Dr. Keller stepped into my foyer, he walked directly into a massive digital net. Every single breath, word, and physical movement was being captured and routed to a secure off-site server managed by Attorney Gallagher. I led Keller into the main sitting room. I offered him a seat on the leather sofa. I sat opposite him in a high-backed armchair. I maintained a posture of complete relaxation. Keller did not waste time with pleasantries. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a digital audio recorder and a stack of printed medical forms. He clicked the record button and placed the device on the glass coffee table. He began the interrogation with aggressive, rapid-fire questions designed to induce profound cognitive confusion. He asked me what year it was. He asked me to name the current president. He asked me to identify the exact street address of the house I was sitting in. I answered each question with perfect, unhesitating accuracy. My voice was calm, steady, and entirely devoid of emotion. Keller realized the standard baseline questions were completely ineffective. He immediately shifted his strategy to severe emotional manipulation. This was the exact tactic Vanessa had likely instructed him to deploy. Keller leaned forward and lowered his voice into a tone of fake, syrupy compassion. He told me that my son Jordan was deeply worried about my declining mental state. He stated that Jordan had provided extensive documentation proving I had recently given away millions of dollars to strangers in a fit of severe paranoid delusion. He claimed I was suffering from aggressive senile dementia and that I had violently kicked my loving family out of their own home without any rational justification. He was attempting to rewrite reality directly to my face. He wanted me to scream. He wanted me to become hostile. He needed an audio recording of an irrational, violent old man to justify the emergency psychiatric hold. I did not take the bait. I remained perfectly placid. I looked directly into his shifting nervous eyes. I politely informed Dr. Keller that I had recently restructured my financial portfolio through an irrevocable blind trust managed by an independent fiduciary board. I explained that I had legally acquired Jordan's property through a standard commercial loan subrogation clause after Jordan committed federal wire fraud. I detailed the exact legal statutes and the precise dollar amounts involved in the transactions. I offered to brew him a fresh cup of dark roast coffee while he processed this information. My absolute lucidity infuriated him. Keller realized his primary tactic was failing miserably. He decided to escalate the physical intimidation. He stood up abruptly, knocking his leather briefcase onto the hardwood floor with a loud crash. He stepped aggressively toward my armchair. He raised his voice to a hostile shout. He demanded that I stop lying to him. He accused me of being completely detached from reality. He stated that if I did not voluntarily sign his medical evaluation forms right now, he would call a medical transport unit and have me forcibly restrained and dragged to a locked psychiatric ward. I did not flinch. I did not raise my hands to defend myself. I looked up at him with a cold, piercing stare. I spoke with a quiet, razor-sharp precision. I informed him that I fully understood his professional position. I stated that I was perfectly willing to accompany him to any medical facility of his choosing, provided we first verified his medical license credentials with the state registry and contacted my corporate attorney to oversee the transport. I smiled and gestured toward his fallen briefcase, politely suggesting he pick up his scattered papers. Keller froze. He looked at my calm demeanor. He looked at the vast, immaculate sitting room. He suddenly realized he was completely out of his depth. He was accustomed to bullying vulnerable, isolated senior citizens. He was not equipped to handle a highly functioning corporate tactician who understood the exact legal parameters of involuntary commitment. He realized he could not provoke a single aggressive response from me. I had given his digital recorder absolutely nothing but flawless, polite cooperation. Keller quickly gathered his papers and shoved them back into his battered briefcase. His face was flushed with a mixture of anger and severe anxiety. He muttered a quick, incoherent excuse about needing to consult with his medical supervisor. He turned and practically ran out of the sitting room. I followed him at a leisurely pace, watching him hurry across the foyer and pull the heavy front door open. He stepped out onto the cold porch and hurried toward his rusted sedan. He did not realize that the exterior directional microphones mounted above the porch pillars were highly sensitive. I stood in the open doorway and watched him fumble for his keys. He pulled his cell phone from his jacket pocket and dialed a number. He put the phone on speaker mode as he unlocked his car door. The crisp, amplified audio carried clearly through the freezing air. Vanessa answered on the first ring. Her voice was shrill and desperate, demanding to know if the target was secured. Keller let out a heavy, frustrated breath. He told her that I was completely lucid and entirely uncooperative. He stated that I had not exhibited a single sign of cognitive decline. Vanessa immediately began to scream through the tiny speaker, calling him useless and demanding he fulfill their contract. Keller interrupted her hysterical shouting. He leaned against the roof of his car. He told her to calm down and check her banking application. He stated that for the agreed-upon $50,000, reality did not matter. He assured Vanessa that the fraudulent medical evaluation forms were completely filled out and officially stamped. He promised her that the emergency psychiatric commitment papers were fully forged, legally binding, and ready to be filed with a corrupt county judge first thing Monday morning. The rusted sedan disappeared down the wet suburban road. I closed the heavy mahogany door and engaged the brass deadbolt. I walked directly to the central security terminal in my private study. I extracted the isolated audio file of Dr. Keller and Vanessa. I encrypted the digital recording and forwarded it immediately to Attorney Gallagher. The fraudulent psychiatric hold was a desperate maneuver, but it signaled a massive hidden variable. Jordan and Vanessa were entirely broke. They had just lost their luxurious suburban mansion. Hiring a corrupt, disgraced medical professional required significant upfront capital or the absolute promise of a massive imminent payday. The timing was too specific. They needed me declared legally incompetent by Monday morning. I sat in my leather chair and analyzed the battlefield. They were racing against a hidden clock. I picked up my secure landline and called Gallagher. I instructed him to deploy his firm's premier private investigator immediately. I needed to uncover their ultimate endgame before the sun rose. Elias Vance arrived at my iron gates exactly 2 hours later. Elias was a former federal forensic accountant who now operated exclusively in corporate espionage and high-asset divorce investigations. He did not wear a suit. He carried a heavy, reinforced metallic briefcase containing military-grade decryption hardware. I guided him into the study and provided him with Jordan and Vanessa's primary phone numbers, email addresses, and the fraudulent corporate tax identification number Jordan had utilized for the commercial loan. Elias connected his terminal to my secure network and began working in absolute silence. I poured 2 cups of black coffee and waited. The digital hunt required extreme patience. 3 hours passed. The digital clock on my desk shifted past 8 in the evening. Elias finally leaned back from his glowing monitors. He did not offer a polite preamble. He turned the primary screen toward me and dismantled the remaining fragments of my son's pathetic reality. The data was utterly devastating. Elias had breached Jordan's encrypted cloud storage and cloned Vanessa's digital communication logs. The first revelation completely exposed the fragile foundation of their marriage. Vanessa was not simply a greedy, entitled woman standing by her ambitious husband. She was actively orchestrating his total ruin from the inside. Elias opened a folder containing dozens of high-resolution photographs and intercepted text messages. Vanessa was having a long-term, highly secretive affair. Her lover was the exact commercial lending officer who had originally approved Jordan's fraudulent real estate loan. He was a wealthy, arrogant banker who specialized in exploiting desperate tech entrepreneurs. The text messages detailed their entire ruthless strategy. Vanessa had deliberately encouraged Jordan to forge my signature. She had pushed him to leverage the warehouse property. She knew the tech startup was guaranteed to fail. Her ultimate objective was to force Jordan into a catastrophic federal crime, wait for the inevitable financial implosion, and then take her legally mandated half of the remaining stolen cash to flee the country with the banker. She viewed Jordan as a completely disposable asset. She was currently playing the role of the hysterical, supportive wife while actively preparing to abandon him to the federal authorities. I stared at the digital photographs of Vanessa smiling in a luxury hotel suite with the corrupt banker. Jordan was entirely oblivious to his wife's profound betrayal. He believed they were an impenetrable team fighting against a cruel, unsupportive father. He was fighting a war on 2 fronts and completely blind to the knife pressed directly against his spine. However, Vanessa's infidelity was merely a secondary complication. Elias tapped his keyboard and minimized the photographs. He opened a highly classified corporate dossier. This was the primary objective. This was the exact reason they needed me locked inside a psychiatric ward by Monday morning. I leaned closer to the monitor. The bold corporate logo at the top of the digital contract made my blood run instantly cold. It was Apex Freight Industries. Apex was a massive cutthroat international logistics conglomerate. In the late 1990s, they had aggressively attempted to run my independent trucking company out of business. They had utilized predatory pricing, poached my best drivers, and attempted to sabotage my federal shipping routes. I had fought them in boardrooms and loading docks for 5 grueling years. I had ultimately defeated them through sheer resilience and superior operational logistics. I had retained my original corporate charter and my exclusive federal shipping licenses even after I sold my physical truck fleet. Those federal licenses were incredibly difficult to obtain. They granted unrestricted access to highly lucrative interstate shipping corridors. Apex Freight had coveted those specific licenses for over 2 decades. Jordan was currently negotiating the absolute sale of my original corporate charter to my oldest corporate enemy. He was operating under the arrogant assumption that I was a senile old man who had simply forgotten to officially dissolve the original holding company. Elias pulled up the detailed email thread between Jordan and the executive acquisition board of Apex Freight. Jordan had agreed to transfer the entire corporate entity, including the priceless federal shipping licenses, for a flat cash payout of $4 million. Apex Freight knew they were dealing with a desperate, inexperienced seller. They were practically stealing the licenses for a fraction of their true commercial value. Elias highlighted the final paragraph of the corporate acquisition contract. It explicitly required the primary shareholder to be present for the final authorization signature. Jordan had informed the Apex executives that his father was suffering from severe advanced dementia and was entirely incapable of managing his own financial affairs. Jordan had promised to provide a certified medical power of attorney and a formal declaration of psychiatric incompetence to legally bypass my physical signature. He was planning to use Dr. Keller's forged medical documents to forcefully strip my name from the corporate charter and execute the multi-million-dollar sale. The entire timeline locked into perfect, terrifying focus. The fake doctor was scheduled to file the fraudulent commitment papers on Monday morning. The state would temporarily freeze my legal autonomy. Jordan would immediately present the court-stamped psychiatric hold to the Apex executives claiming absolute emergency guardianship over my assets. He would sign the transfer documents, collect the $4 million, and attempt to vanish before the bank fraud investigation caught up to him. He was willing to lock his own father inside a padded room to satisfy a temporary cash deficit. I stood up and paced the length of the study. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal was staggering, but my mind remained remarkably clear. I asked Elias for the exact logistical details of the upcoming transaction. Elias swiftly accessed the encrypted corporate calendar of the Apex managing director. He pulled up the finalized digital itinerary. The rival company had scheduled the final acquisition meeting for exactly 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning. The meeting was set to take place in the premium executive boardroom on the 50th floor of the Apex corporate headquarters downtown. Jordan was expected to arrive with the finalized medical documentation and execute the transfer in person. I instructed Elias to download every single piece of intercepted data onto a secure encrypted flash drive. I wanted Vanessa's explicit text messages with the corrupt banker. I wanted the complete email chain between Jordan and Apex Freight. I wanted absolute proof of their entire coordinated conspiracy. Elias transferred the heavy data files in total silence. He disconnected his military-grade terminal, packed his metallic briefcase, and shook my hand. He knew he had just armed me with enough digital ammunition to obliterate an entire family structure. I paid him his exorbitant fee in cash and walked him to the front door. I returned to the private study and locked the heavy wooden door. I sat down at my desk and placed the encrypted flash drive next to the certified medical affidavit proving my absolute cognitive sanity. Jordan believed he had outsmarted the system. He believed he was going to walk into a corporate boardroom on Tuesday morning, present a forged medical document, and sell my legacy to my oldest enemy. He had absolutely no idea that the prey he was hunting had already transformed into the apex predator. I decided I would not wait for him to execute his final maneuver. I was going to attend that specific corporate acquisition meeting myself. I left the encrypted flash drive locked inside my steel wall safe and slept for exactly 4 hours. My mind was no longer plagued by the emotional betrayal of my son. It was operating with the cold, frictionless efficiency of a corporate machine preparing for a hostile takeover. At dawn on Monday, I drove my Chevrolet directly to the downtown financial district. The city was just waking up, shrouded in a dense, freezing fog. I parked in the underground garage of Attorney Gallagher's high-rise building and took the private executive elevator straight to the top floor. Gallagher was already waiting in his corner office. His heavy oak desk was covered in pristine legal notepads and thick federal statutes. I sat down and placed the metallic flash drive directly in the center of his desk. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I instructed him to open the files Elias Vance had extracted from Jordan's digital footprint. Gallagher inserted the drive into his secure terminal. I watched his professional composure harden into absolute icy focus as he scanned the intercepted data. He saw the high-resolution photographs of Vanessa with the corrupt commercial lending officer. He read the explicit text messages detailing their coordinated strategy to force Jordan into federal wire fraud and steal the remaining liquid assets. Then he opened the primary corporate dossier regarding Apex Freight Industries. He read the finalized acquisition contract Jordan had negotiated to sell my original logistics charter for $4 million. Gallagher leaned back in his leather chair. He removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He stated that the sheer volume of federal felonies Jordan and Vanessa had committed over the past 30 days was staggering. He immediately began outlining the legal retaliation. He drafted a comprehensive roadmap for a massive civil and criminal offensive. He listed the exact charges with ruthless precision: wire fraud, bank fraud, conspiracy to commit corporate espionage, identity theft, elder financial abuse, fraudulent medical coercion. He explained that we possessed enough digital and physical evidence to completely obliterate their lives. He pulled out a fresh legal pad and began writing the official referral to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He stated that with the forged commercial loan documents and the intercepted communications, the federal prosecutor would approve an immediate arrest warrant. He reached for his desk phone to contact his liaison at the district attorney's office. He wanted Jordan and Vanessa in handcuffs before noon. I reached across the desk and placed my hand firmly over his phone. I pressed the receiver back into the cradle. Gallagher looked at me with profound confusion. He warned me that waiting carried unnecessary risks. He argued that Jordan was actively attempting to execute a multi-million-dollar corporate theft. He stated that allowing a criminal to roam free when we possessed absolute proof was a dangerous game. I shook my head. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling city below. I explained my strategy with slow, deliberate calculation. If we called the federal authorities right now, Jordan would inevitably play the victim. He would hire a charismatic defense attorney and claim he was simply exploring hypothetical corporate options under severe financial duress. He would argue that the forged commercial loan was a desperate mistake, not a calculated conspiracy. He would point to his failing tech startup and beg for judicial leniency. He would attempt to manipulate a sympathetic jury by crying about the overwhelming pressure of living up to a successful father. I refused to grant him that pathetic escape route. I refused to let him manipulate the narrative. I told Gallagher we were going to hold the trap completely open. We were going to let Jordan walk directly into the Apex Freight corporate boardroom tomorrow morning. We were going to allow him to sit down with the Executive Acquisition Board, present his fraudulent documentation, and attempt to physically execute the sale of my company. I wanted the crime to transition from digital intent to undeniable physical execution. I wanted him to commit the ultimate corporate treason in a room filled with hostile corporate witnesses and high-definition security cameras. I wanted him to dig a hole so unimaginably deep that no defense attorney on earth could ever pull him out. Gallagher stared at me in silence. He slowly absorbed the magnitude of my strategy. A slow, sharp smile spread across his face. He recognized the ruthless efficiency of the maneuver. He agreed to embargo the federal referrals for exactly 24 hours. He turned back to his secure terminal and began drafting the final civil lawsuits. He prepared the absolute asset freezes, the permanent restraining orders, and the corporate injunctions that would legally suffocate Jordan and Vanessa the moment the trap snapped shut. We spent the next 6 hours dissecting the Apex Freight acquisition contract line by line. We needed to understand the exact mechanical process Jordan intended to use to bypass my legal authority. I owned 100% of the original corporate charter. My physical signature was an absolute federal requirement for any transfer of ownership, especially one involving highly regulated interstate shipping licenses. Apex Freight possessed a battalion of corporate lawyers. They would never authorize a multi-million-dollar acquisition without an airtight chain of custody. Gallagher magnified the final page of the digital contract on his secondary monitor. He highlighted the specific addendum Jordan had attached to the primary signatory line. My eyes scanned the dense legal jargon, and a profound, icy realization washed over me. Jordan was not simply planning to forge my signature on the corporate sale documents. He was utilizing a completely fabricated, highly detailed, durable power of attorney. I read the fraudulent document closely. It was a masterpiece of legal deception. It granted Jordan absolute, unrestricted control over my entire existence. The clauses were breathtaking in their malicious scope. The document authorized him to liquidate my financial portfolio, transfer my corporate holdings, sell my private estate, and dictate my physical health care. It explicitly stated that the power of attorney was triggered instantly upon my medical incapacitation. Jordan had attached the forged psychiatric evaluation from Dr. Keller directly to the addendum. He had used the fake doctor's fraudulent dementia diagnosis to legally activate the forged power of attorney. He had manufactured a scenario where my legal autonomy was instantly transferred to him the moment the ink dried on the fake medical evaluation. The ultimate endgame was finally exposed in its entirety. Jordan was not just trying to steal a $4 million payout from Apex Freight. He was actively attempting to erase my entire legal personhood. He was using the fake psychiatric hold to strip away my fundamental human rights. He intended to walk into that corporate boardroom tomorrow morning and declare me legally dead to the financial world. He believed he held the absolute legal authority to dismantle my legacy, sell my company to my oldest rival, and lock me in a concrete medical facility until I died. I looked at the forged signature on the fraudulent power of attorney. The sheer malice of the document did not make me angry. It made me absolutely invincible. Jordan had handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy him completely. I told Gallagher to print a certified physical copy of the forged document. I folded the heavy paper and placed it into the inner pocket of my canvas coat right next to the certified medical affidavit proving my absolute cognitive sanity. The pieces were perfectly aligned. The final confrontation was only hours away, and I was holding the key to his absolute destruction. Tuesday morning arrived with a biting, bitter cold. I moved through my estate with mechanical precision. I put on a tailored charcoal suit and a heavy canvas coat. I did not look like an elderly man suffering from cognitive decline. I looked like a corporate titan preparing for a hostile boardroom execution. I retrieved the heavy leather briefcase from my private study. Inside lay the certified medical affidavit proving my absolute sanity, the physical copy of Jordan's forged power of attorney, and the encrypted flash drive containing the complete architecture of his federal conspiracy. I drove my Chevrolet pickup truck out of my private gates as the sun breached the city skyline. I navigated the dense morning traffic toward the financial district. The Apex Freight Industries headquarters stood at the very center of the corporate grid. It was a towering monolith of black glass and brushed steel. It represented 20 years of cutthroat corporate warfare. Apex had spent decades attempting to crush my independent logistics company. They had aggressively lobbied against my federal shipping routes and attempted to bankrupt my primary supply chains. I had defeated them at every single turn through superior operational discipline. Now my own flesh and blood was preparing to hand them the keys to my kingdom for a pathetic $4 million bribe. I parked my truck in the subterranean garage 2 blocks away from the Apex Tower. The wind whipped between the high-rise buildings as I walked toward the main entrance. I stepped through the revolving glass doors into the cavernous, brightly lit lobby. The security perimeter was formidable. A bank of digital turnstiles blocked the elevator banks manned by a dozen uniformed corporate guards. I knew Jordan was highly meticulous when his own survival was at stake. He had undoubtedly provided my photograph to the front desk, claiming his severely demented father might wander into the building and cause a disruption. If I approached the reception desk, the security team would instantly alert the boardroom. Jordan would abort the sale and flee before the trap closed. I bypassed the main reception desk entirely. I walked toward a secondary corridor designated for commercial freight and building logistics. I pulled my secure cell phone from my pocket and dialed a direct unlisted extension. Marcus Thorne answered on the second ring. 25 years ago, Marcus was an independent freight dispatcher drowning in insurmountable corporate debt. The major conglomerates had blacklisted his small fleet. I had stepped in and handed his family a massive, highly lucrative federal shipping contract. I had saved his entire livelihood without asking for a single favor in return. Today, Marcus was the vice president of physical operations for Apex Freight. I spoke quietly into the receiver. I informed Marcus that I was currently standing in his primary lobby. I told him I required immediate, unquestioned access to the 50th floor without leaving a digital footprint in the visitor registry. Marcus did not ask a single question. He simply instructed me to wait by the service doors. 60 seconds later, a senior security supervisor in a dark suit pushed through the heavy steel doors. He did not ask for my identification. He did not scan my face. He respectfully gestured for me to follow him. We bypassed the biometric scanners and entered a private executive elevator reserved exclusively for board members. The steel doors closed silently. The digital display climbed rapidly toward the 50th floor. I was completely invisible to the building's surveillance registry. Jordan remained entirely blind to my presence. The elevator doors slid open. The 50th floor was a fortress of silent corporate power. Thick, sound-dampening carpets lined the hallway. Expensive mahogany paneling covered the walls. Marcus Thorne was waiting for me in a shadowed alcove directly adjacent to the primary executive boardroom. He shook my hand with a firm, silent grip. He pointed toward the heavy, frosted glass double doors down the corridor. He confirmed that the Apex executive acquisition team was currently assembling inside. They were preparing the final corporate transfer documents. They were eagerly waiting to finalize the theft of my federal shipping licenses. I thanked Marcus for his absolute loyalty. He nodded once and retreated toward his private office. I stood alone in the quiet alcove, watching the blurred silhouettes moving behind the frosted glass. A moment later, a secondary elevator chimed softly down the hall. Attorney Gallagher stepped out. He was carrying his own heavy leather briefcase. He was not alone. A tall, broad-shouldered man walked purposefully beside him. The man wore a dark, immaculate suit. A highly polished gold star badge was clipped visibly to his leather belt. This was Deputy Marshal Reynolds of the United States Marshals Service. Gallagher had not simply called the local police precinct. He had leveraged the overwhelming evidence of federal wire fraud, interstate commercial theft, and the conspiracy to forge legal medical documents to trigger an immediate federal response. Reynolds possessed the absolute legal authority to execute a federal arrest warrant the exact second the fraudulent documents were presented for signature. Gallagher stepped into the alcove beside me. He spoke in a hushed, precise tone. He confirmed that the federal prosecutor had reviewed Elias Vance's encrypted data cache overnight. The text messages between Vanessa and the corrupt banker, combined with Jordan's forged commercial loan documents, had secured the emergency warrants. Reynolds was here to physically secure the perimeter and execute the arrest. We simply needed Jordan to commit the final undeniable act of corporate treason. We needed him to legally present the forged power of attorney to the Apex board. I checked the heavy gold face of my wristwatch. It was 8:55 in the morning. The corridor remained perfectly silent. At exactly 8:58, the primary executive elevator chimed a clear, sharp tone. The polished steel doors slid open. Jordan stepped out onto the 50th floor. I watched my son from the shadows of the alcove. He was wearing an incredibly expensive bespoke suit. His hair was perfectly styled. He carried a sleek silver briefcase containing the forged medical affidavits and the fraudulent legal documents. He exuded the toxic, smug arrogance of a man who believed he had just successfully outsmarted the entire world. He walked with a confident, aggressive stride. He believed he was about to collect $4 million and permanently erase my legal existence. He did not glance toward the shadows. He did not notice the three men standing silently just 50 feet away. Jordan walked directly up to the heavy frosted glass doors of the executive boardroom. He paused for a fraction of a second. He adjusted his silk tie. He took a deep, steadying breath to perfect his performance as a grieving, responsible son, taking over his severely incapacitated father's business. He pushed the heavy glass doors open and stepped into the brightly lit boardroom. The heavy doors swung shut behind him, sealing him inside with the Apex executives. I looked at Attorney Gallagher. I looked at Deputy Marshal Reynolds. The trap was fully loaded. Jordan was currently sitting at the mahogany table opening his silver briefcase. He was physically handing the forged medical documents to the rival executives. The crime was shifting from digital intent to absolute, irreversible physical execution. He was legally locking himself inside a federal cage. I buttoned my canvas coat. I stepped out of the shadowed alcove and walked directly toward the boardroom doors. My legal team and the federal marshal fell into step immediately behind me. We marched down the silent, carpeted corridor. I reached out and grabbed the thick brass handles of the frosted glass doors. Did Jordan recognize the depth of the federal trap he had just walked into? I gripped the thick brass handles of the frosted glass doors and pushed them inward with absolute, unhesitating force. The heavy doors swung wide open, hitting the rubber wall stops with a dull, resonant thud. I stepped over the threshold and walked directly into the hostile territory of my oldest corporate rival. The executive boardroom was a sprawling, immaculate monument to corporate intimidation. A massive mahogany table stretched across the center of the room, flanked by high-backed leather chairs. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, commanding view of the city's financial district below. 5 senior executives from Apex Freight Industries sat around the table. They wore pristine, tailored suits and possessed the cold, calculating posture of Apex predators. They were men who built careers by dismantling weaker companies and absorbing their assets. Jordan stood at the head of the table. His sleek silver briefcase rested open on the polished mahogany surface. He was in the middle of a confident, aggressive presentation. He was physically handing out the freshly printed copies of the corporate transfer agreement. He was seconds away from executing the final signature. The sudden intrusion instantly shattered the quiet, controlled atmosphere of the acquisition meeting. Jordan stopped speaking mid-sentence. He turned his head toward the entrance. His confident, arrogant smile vanished with violent speed. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. He stared at me as if I were a ghost materializing from the floorboards. He expected me to be heavily sedated, wearing a paper gown and locked behind the reinforced steel doors of a psychiatric ward. He had paid $50,000 for that exact reality. Instead, I was standing inside his impenetrable corporate sanctuary wearing a bespoke charcoal suit radiating absolute physical and mental authority. His brain simply could not process the catastrophic failure of his master plan. He physically staggered backward, bumping his hip against the edge of the heavy table. I did not look at my son. I ignored his pathetic, hyperventilating panic entirely. I directed my attention exclusively to the 5 executives seated around the table. The lead negotiator sat directly across from Jordan. He was an older, ruthless man named Sterling. 20 years ago, Sterling was the aggressive regional director who had personally attempted to run my independent logistics fleet into absolute bankruptcy. He had orchestrated the predatory pricing models and the vicious poaching of my primary commercial drivers. I had fought him in loading docks and federal regulatory hearings for half a decade, eventually crushing his regional expansion and securing my federal shipping licenses. Sterling narrowed his cold, slate-gray eyes. He recognized me instantly. He looked at the tailored cut of my suit. He looked at my steady, unwavering posture. He looked at the sheer terror vibrating off Jordan. Sterling possessed the sharp, ruthless instincts of a corporate survivor. He instantly sensed the lethal, high-stakes shift in the room's dynamic. He realized the desperate, inexperienced seller he was manipulating had just been cornered by a much larger, much more dangerous predator. Jordan frantically attempted to salvage the collapsing narrative. His survival depended entirely on maintaining the illusion of his absolute control. He stepped away from his silver briefcase and raised his trembling hands in a pathetic display of mock sympathy. He forced a strained, agonizing smile. He looked at the apex executives and spoke in a hushed, apologetic tone. He claimed there had been a terrible security breach. He stated that his father was suffering from severe advanced dementia and required immediate medical containment. He lied directly to their faces, claiming I had somehow wandered away from my private residential care facility and managed to stumble into the downtown financial district. He asked Sterling to call building security to have me gently escorted back to a medical transport unit before I caused a humiliating public disruption. He was desperately throwing water on a raging chemical fire. I walked forward. My heavy leather shoes made no sound on the thick, sound-dampening carpet. I stopped directly across from Sterling, positioning myself at the exact center of the mahogany table. I commanded the entire physical space of the room. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a slow, icy, and deeply resonant cadence that demanded absolute obedience. I looked directly at Sterling and informed him that 20 years ago he had attempted to steal my federal shipping routes through aggressive, cutthroat sabotage. I stated that he had failed completely then, and he was failing completely today, because he was attempting to purchase my legacy from an incompetent, desperate thief. Sterling stiffened in his high-backed leather chair. The other 4 executives shifted uncomfortably, exchanging nervous, rapid glances. They realized they were no longer conducting a standard corporate acquisition. They were sitting in the exact blast radius of a massive, uncontained detonation. Jordan abandoned his facade of the sympathetic son. Panic entirely consumed his fragile ego. He slammed his fist against the table and shouted at me to leave the boardroom immediately. He pointed a shaking finger at the forged documents resting inside his silver briefcase. He declared loudly that he held the absolute legally binding durable power of attorney. He shrieked that my medical incompetence was officially certified and that I possessed absolutely zero legal authority to interrupt the transaction. He demanded that Sterling sign the transfer papers immediately to finalize the $4 million buyout. I reached into the deep inner pocket of my canvas coat. I extracted the thick, certified medical affidavit signed by Dr. Thorne and the independent neuropsychologist. I pulled out the original heavily watermarked corporate charter of my logistics firm, proving my absolute sole ownership of the federal shipping licenses. I retrieved the high-resolution certified copies of Jordan's forged commercial real estate loan. I held the heavy stack of documents high in the air for a single agonizing second. I wanted the entire room to witness the precise instrument of his destruction. I slammed the documents down onto the polished mahogany table. The impact cracked through the silent boardroom like a rifle shot. I looked directly into Sterling's eyes. I delivered the absolute unvarnished truth with surgical, devastating precision. I informed the Apex Executive Board that the silver briefcase Jordan was desperately clutching contained a completely fabricated psychiatric evaluation. I explained that the medical diagnosis was purchased from a disgraced corrupt physician for a $50,000 cash bribe late yesterday afternoon. I explicitly stated that the durable power of attorney Jordan was using to authorize the corporate sale was a criminal forgery designed specifically to bypass my legal signature. I tapped my index finger against the heavy stack of certified documents I had just dropped on the table. I instructed Sterling to read the medical affidavit. I stated that the document was executed less than 72 hours ago by the chief of forensic psychiatry at the state's premier research hospital. I explained that the affidavit was officially registered with the county court, providing irrefutable legally binding proof of my absolute cognitive sanity and total executive function. I leaned forward, resting my hands firmly on the edge of the mahogany table. I closed the trap completely. I told the Apex executives that if they placed a single drop of ink onto Jordan's fraudulent transfer documents, they would not be acquiring a highly lucrative logistics company. They would be actively and voluntarily participating in a multi-million-dollar federal wire fraud conspiracy, severe identity theft, and corporate espionage. I stated that signing that contract would immediately trigger a massive federal indictment against the entire Apex Freight Corporation. The boardroom froze. The air grew incredibly thin. Sterling stared at the certified documents resting on the table. He slowly turned his head and looked at Jordan. Jordan was hyperventilating. His chest heaved erratically as his lungs fought for oxygen. His hands shook so violently he could barely grip the edge of his own silver briefcase. He looked at the 5 corporate executives. He saw the cold, dawning realization in their eyes. They knew he had tried to make them unwitting accomplices to a massive federal felony. The corporate allies he desperately needed to secure his survival had instantly transformed into highly motivated, deeply hostile witnesses. Jordan realized his entire fabricated universe had just been incinerated. He was completely exposed in a room full of Apex predators. He frantically began shoving his forged papers back into his briefcase, desperately seeking an escape route. He believed he could still grab his fraudulent documents, run out of the building, and somehow vanish before the authorities caught up to him. He spun around to sprint toward the frosted glass doors. He stopped dead in his tracks. Attorney Gallagher and Deputy Marshal Reynolds had stepped fully into the boardroom. The towering federal marshal blocked the primary exit with his massive physical frame, his hand resting casually near his heavy utility belt. The polished gold star badge gleamed under the bright fluorescent lights. The final exit was permanently sealed. Sterling did not become an industry titan by ignoring glaring legal hazards. He possessed the sharp, ruthless instincts of a corporate survivor who had spent decades navigating treacherous financial waters. He looked at the towering federal marshal blocking the primary boardroom doors. He looked down at the certified medical affidavit signed by the chief of forensic psychiatry, legally proving my absolute mental competence. He looked at the fraudulent commercial loan documents displaying my blatantly forged signature. His slate-gray eyes calculated the sheer catastrophic liability Jordan had just dragged into his immaculate corporate headquarters. Sterling realized instantly that he was no longer sitting in an acquisition meeting. He was sitting at ground zero of a massive federal sting operation. Sterling reached across the polished mahogany table. He gathered the heavy stack of acquisition contracts Jordan had distributed just moments prior. He stacked them neatly, tapping the edges against the wood to perfectly align the thick, expensive paper. He did not say a single word to my son. He did not ask for an explanation. He gripped the top of the stack and tore the documents cleanly in half. He placed the shredded pages into the leather wastebasket beside his chair. He looked directly at me and stated for the official recorded record that Apex Freight Industries had absolutely zero involvement in this fraudulent transaction. He declared that any preliminary negotiations were entirely null and void. He signaled to the other 4 executives seated around the table. They stood up in perfect unison, buttoned their tailored suit jackets, and swiftly exited the boardroom through a secondary side door. They vanished into the corporate labyrinth, entirely washing their hands of the impending legal bloodbath. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with a federal crime scene. Jordan watched his $4 million lifeline vanish into the leather wastebasket. His knees buckled slightly. He grabbed the back of a heavy chair to prevent himself from collapsing onto the floor. He turned his desperate, bloodshot eyes toward the primary entrance, searching for any possible avenue of escape. Deputy Marshal Reynolds did not move from the threshold. Instead, he raised his right hand and gestured down the carpeted corridor. 2 additional federal agents stepped into the doorway. They were not alone. They were physically escorting Vanessa into the boardroom. Vanessa had been waiting in the plush executive lounge down the hall, sipping sparkling water and casually browsing luxury real estate listings on her phone. She had eagerly anticipated Jordan returning with a signed corporate buyout and a massive wire transfer to restore her lavish lifestyle. Instead, she had been intercepted and flanked by federal authorities. The agents directed her into the room and stepped back, sealing the entrance once again. Vanessa stumbled forward, her expensive high heels catching on the thick carpet. She looked at the torn contracts resting in the wastebasket. She looked at Jordan's completely shattered physical posture. She looked at me standing tall and utterly unbothered at the head of the mahogany table. Her sharp, ruthless survival instinct engaged instantly. She realized the multi-million-dollar heist had failed catastrophically. She knew she was standing at the absolute epicenter of a massive federal indictment. She did not rush to comfort her husband. She turned on him with the vicious speed of a cornered predator. She pointed a manicured finger directly at Jordan's chest and unleashed a torrent of frantic, high-pitched accusations. She screamed that she had absolutely no prior knowledge of the forged documents. She claimed Jordan had lied to her for months about his financial stability and his business operations. She shrieked that he had manipulated her into believing I was genuinely suffering from severe cognitive decline. She played the role of the innocent, terrified wife with flawless theatrical precision. She stated clearly and loudly, ensuring the federal agents heard every single syllable, that Jordan alone was the criminal mastermind behind the entire operation. Jordan stared at his wife in absolute paralyzing horror. The final pillar of his fabricated reality crumbled into fine dust. He had committed federal wire fraud to maintain her luxurious standard of living. He had attempted to legally erase my existence to secure her unearned wealth. He had risked a decade in federal prison to appease her endless, insatiable greed. Now the exact woman he had destroyed his life to protect was viciously throwing him to the wolves. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a pathetic, breathless gasp escaped his throat. He was entirely broken. He had sacrificed his own father for a woman who viewed him as a completely disposable asset. Vanessa turned her tear-filled eyes toward me. She clasped her hands together in a gesture of desperate pleading. She begged me to tell the federal marshal that she was completely innocent. She swore she would divorce Jordan immediately and cooperate fully with the authorities to ensure he was prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. She genuinely believed her deceptive performance was actually working. She still thought she possessed the manipulative charm to outsmart the situation and secure her own freedom. I did not smile. I did not raise my voice. I simply nodded to Attorney Gallagher. Gallagher stepped forward and unclasped his heavy leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick stack of printed high-resolution transcripts. They were the exact digital communication logs Elias Vance had extracted from Vanessa's encrypted cloud storage during the night. Gallagher handed the top page directly to Vanessa. I watched her eyes dart across the highlighted text. I watched the fake tears instantly dry up. Her face turned chalk white. I spoke with a slow, icy, and deeply resonant cadence. I informed Vanessa that I had legally acquired her complete digital footprint. I stated that I had read the explicit text messages she sent to the corrupt commercial lending officer. I explained that I knew she had actively encouraged Jordan to forge my signature on the commercial loan. I detailed her exact documented plan to force Jordan into a catastrophic federal felony, wait for the inevitable financial implosion, and then flee the country with the banker using her legally mandated half of the stolen cash. I made it absolutely clear that she was not an innocent victim. She was a fully documented, highly active co-conspirator in a massive corporate espionage and wire fraud syndicate. Vanessa dropped the printed transcript. The paper fluttered silently to the floor. She could not formulate a single word of defense. Her theatrical performance was entirely annihilated by cold, hard digital evidence. She looked at the towering federal marshal, realizing her luxurious life was permanently over. She realized she was not going to Paris with a wealthy banker. She was going to a federal penitentiary. The absolute silence in the boardroom was suffocating. The air felt heavy, charged with the undeniable reality of their total destruction. Jordan and Vanessa stood miles apart, separated by their mutual vicious betrayal. They possessed no home. They possessed no money. They possessed no corporate leverage. They were completely stripped of their false identities, standing exposed in the harsh fluorescent lighting of a rival company's headquarters. I buttoned my canvas coat. I looked at my son one final time. I felt no parental obligation to offer comfort. I felt no remorse for the trap I had flawlessly executed. He had attempted to lock me inside a concrete medical facility and steal the legacy I had built with my bare hands. I had simply reflected his profound malice back onto him with overwhelming, impenetrable force. The financial and legal architecture of his ruin was completely irreversible. I turned my back on them and walked slowly toward the exit. I stepped aside, leaving the center of the room entirely open. Deputy Marshal Reynolds stepped forward. His heavy leather boots thudded loudly against the floor. He reached down to his tactical belt. The sharp metallic clatter of heavy steel handcuffs echoed through the silent boardroom. He looked directly at my son and stated the official charges. The heavy steel handcuffs produced a sharp, unforgiving clatter that resonated violently against the polished mahogany walls of the executive boardroom. Deputy Marshal Reynolds did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He possessed the absolute crushing authority of the federal government. He stepped directly into Jordan's personal space and commanded him to place his hands behind his back. Reynolds delivered the charges with the mechanical, devastating precision of a firing squad. He listed the exact statutes Jordan had violated over the past 30 days: conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, the fabrication and distribution of fraudulent medical documents, attempted corporate espionage, and extortion. Every single charge carried a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. Jordan's bespoke suit suddenly looked like a cheap costume. The smug, arrogant posture he had carried into the Apex Freight headquarters completely evaporated. His knees buckled under the crushing weight of reality. The federal agents flanked him immediately, grabbing his arms and forcing them behind his back. The ratcheting sound of the steel cuffs locking around his wrists echoed like a final death knell for his fabricated empire. Jordan panicked. The sophisticated corporate predator vanished instantly, replaced by a terrified, desperate child. He thrashed weakly against the grip of the federal agents. He whipped his head around his bloodshot eyes, darting wildly across the room until they locked onto me. I stood entirely motionless near the frosted glass doors. I watched the physical destruction of my own son with absolute frictionless detachment. He stumbled forward, dragging the two federal agents with him for a fraction of an inch before they yanked him back. He stared at me with tears streaming down his face. He abandoned every ounce of his pride. He began to beg. He screamed my name. He pleaded with me to stop the federal marshals. He cried that he was my only son. He claimed that the entire corporate conspiracy was a massive, terrible misunderstanding. He swore that he had been under insurmountable financial pressure and that his failing tech startup had driven him to a state of temporary insanity. He begged me to tell Attorney Gallagher to drop the civil injunctions. He promised he would return every single dollar he had stolen. He promised he would dissolve his company, attend counseling, and spend the rest of his life making amends for his actions. He weaponized our shared blood, desperately hoping to trigger a dormant reserve of paternal mercy. I did not move a single muscle. I did not display an ounce of anger, sadness, or vindication. I simply looked at the terrified man completely bound by steel chains. I took a slow, deliberate step forward. The boardroom grew terrifyingly quiet. Even the federal agents paused, allowing the gravity of the confrontation to settle over the room. I looked directly into Jordan's hyperventilating face. I did not yell. I spoke with a quiet, icy cadence that cut straight through the heavy corporate air. I informed him that a man does not forge psychiatric evaluation forms by mistake. A man does not attempt to lock his own father inside a locked medical ward out of temporary panic. A man does not orchestrate the theft of a multi-million-dollar corporate charter without absolute premeditated malice. I stated clearly that he had made a series of highly calculated, ruthless decisions. Now he was simply experiencing the mandatory consequences of his own arrogance. Jordan collapsed onto his knees, sobbing uncontrollably onto the thick boardroom carpet. He repeated that he was my flesh and blood. He demanded to know how a father could stand by and watch his son be dragged away to a federal cage. I reached into my memory and extracted the exact digital weapon he had handed me 6 months ago. I looked down at him. I reminded him of the morning of his 35th birthday. I had driven 2 hours to his suburban mansion. I had brought a vintage bottle of scotch and a handwritten card. I had stood on his front porch hoping to bridge the widening gap between us. He had refused to open the heavy mahogany door. He had watched me through the security camera and sent a single devastating text message to my phone. I recited his exact words with flawless, absolute precision. I do not need a father. You are a relic of a dead era. The only gift I want for my birthday is for you to disappear from my life forever. The words hung in the cold boardroom air, heavy with the weight of absolute finality. Jordan choked on his own breath. His eyes widened in profound, paralyzing horror. He realized the exact magnitude of his own cruelty had returned to execute him. I adjusted the cuffs of my canvas coat. I looked down at him with zero remaining empathy. I told him I was a man of my word. I stated that I was simply granting his birthday wish. I had permanently disappeared from his life. I instructed Deputy Marshal Reynolds to remove him from the building. The agents hauled Jordan to his feet. He did not fight back. He did not speak another word. His spirit was entirely broken. They marched him out of the boardroom, his head hanging in total defeat. While the federal marshals focused entirely on securing Jordan, a silent secondary maneuver was taking place in the background. Vanessa had watched her husband collapse. She had watched the federal trap snap shut around his wrists. Her ruthless survival instinct calculated the immediate odds of her own capture. The agents in the boardroom were temporarily occupied with a highly emotional, struggling suspect. The door to the secondary executive corridor remained partially open. Vanessa did not hesitate. She abandoned her husband without a single backward glance. She moved with the silent, desperate speed of a rat fleeing a sinking ship. She slipped through the side door, her expensive high heels making virtually no sound on the plush corporate carpet. She bypassed the main elevator bank, entirely seeking out the discreet service elevators utilized by the building's maintenance staff. Her mind raced with frantic, desperate calculations. She possessed her passport in her designer handbag. She had access to a hidden offshore account established by her corrupt banking lover. She believed she could exit the Apex Freight building, hail a taxi, and reach the international terminal before the federal authorities realized she was missing. She believed she was infinitely smarter than the men in the boardroom. She rode the service elevator down 50 floors, staring at the descending digital numbers with a triumphant, adrenaline-fueled smirk. The service elevator chimed softly. The metal doors slid open, revealing the expansive, brightly lit ground floor lobby. Vanessa stepped out, adjusting her posture. She smoothed the fabric of her designer dress. She transformed her terrified expression into a mask of cold, unbothered corporate elegance. She walked briskly toward the massive revolving glass doors leading to the busy downtown street. Freedom was exactly 50 feet away. She took 10 rapid steps before her path was entirely blocked. 2 men wearing dark suits and federal credentials stepped directly in front of her. They did not belong to the Marshal Service. They wore the distinct polished insignia of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Division. Attorney Gallagher had not left a single variable to chance. The trap was a multi-layered masterpiece of legal strategy. Vanessa stopped abruptly, her triumphant smirk shattered. She tried to step around them, stammering a pathetic excuse about a medical emergency. The lead FBI agent did not move. He reached out and grabbed her wrist with an iron grip. He did not mention the forged power of attorney or the corporate boardroom. He informed Vanessa that she was officially under arrest for massive coordinated credit card fraud and severe elder financial abuse. He stated that the Bureau possessed absolute proof that she had stolen my identity, opened multiple fraudulent lines of credit, and executed massive unauthorized transactions over the past 90 days. He forced her arms behind her back. Vanessa shrieked, struggling violently against the agents. Her carefully cultivated facade of elegant superiority was entirely obliterated. She screamed insults at the agents, thrashing her body in a desperate, undignified panic right in the middle of the crowded Apex Freight lobby. Dozens of corporate employees and rival executives stopped to watch the spectacular, humiliating arrest, the cold steel handcuffs locked securely around her wrists. The illusion was over. The empire of lies was burned to the ground. The apex predator had completely cleared the board. I sat in the passenger seat of Attorney Gallagher's luxury sedan as we drove away from the Apex Freight building. The freezing morning fog had finally lifted, revealing a stark, brilliantly lit city. My phone rested on the center console. I was not waiting for an apology. I was waiting for the inevitable operational updates from the federal courthouse. The physical confrontation in the boardroom was merely the ignition sequence. The true devastation was currently unfolding inside the sterile, heavily guarded walls of the Federal Detention Center downtown. Gallagher received the first direct briefing from his liaison within the district attorney's office shortly before noon. He placed the call on the vehicle's secure speakerphone. The federal processing was a brutal mechanical machine designed to strip away every ounce of corporate arrogance. Jordan and Vanessa were entirely separated upon arrival. They were fingerprinted, photographed, and systematically stripped of their expensive personal possessions. Jordan's bespoke charcoal suit and silk tie were confiscated and replaced with a rigid, brightly colored holding jumpsuit. His silver briefcase containing the forged medical documents and the fraudulent corporate contracts was officially logged into the federal evidence vault as Exhibit A. Jordan was placed in a cold concrete holding cell alongside low-level offenders. He immediately demanded access to his private legal counsel. He demanded his cell phone to transfer funds for his bail hearing. The federal marshals simply ignored his aggressive posturing. They informed him that his entire financial existence had been completely paralyzed. Gallagher's civil injunctions and the federal asset freeze had locked down his corporate accounts. his personal checking, and his hidden offshore reserves, he possessed absolutely zero liquid capital. He was entirely dependent on the federal system he had arrogantly attempted to manipulate. He was granted one single monitored phone call. Jordan did not call me. He knew that Bridge was permanently incinerated. Instead, he dialed the private estate of his wealthy father-in-law, Richard Sterling. Richard was a ruthless, deeply entrenched real estate developer who had always viewed Jordan's tech startup with thinly veiled skepticism. Jordan believed his marriage to Vanessa guaranteed him an impenetrable safety net. He believed Richard would instantly deploy his massive fortune and his premier legal team to secure their immediate release. Gallagher's contact relayed the exact humiliating details of that specific phone call. Jordan stood in the noisy holding area clutching the heavy plastic receiver. He frantically explained the situation to Richard, attempting to frame the federal arrest as a massive corporate misunderstanding. He begged his father-in-law to wire the necessary capital for a high-tier defense attorney. He promised he could clear Vanessa's name and resolve the federal indictments if he just had the upfront cash to fight the charges. Richard did not raise his voice. He did not express a single ounce of paternal concern for his son-in-law. He operated with the same cold transactional logic that Vanessa possessed. Richard informed Jordan that his legal team had already spoken with the federal prosecutor. He stated that he had seen the digital evidence regarding the forged commercial real estate loan and the fraudulent medical documents. He explicitly told Jordan that he was a catastrophic financial liability. Richard delivered the final crushing blow without a shred of hesitation. He stated that his family's vast wealth would be utilized exclusively to extract Vanessa from the federal indictment. He absolutely refused to spend a single dime defending a bankrupt, incompetent criminal who had dragged his daughter into a federal wire fraud conspiracy. He instructed Jordan to never contact his family again, informed him that Vanessa would be filing for divorce the moment she was released, and permanently disconnected the line. Jordan was left listening to the dead dial tone echoing in his ear. The absolute reality of his isolation finally crushed his spirit. The marriage had always been a parasitic, highly toxic transaction. Vanessa had fed on his blind ambition and his stolen funds to maintain her lavish lifestyle. Now that the funds were frozen and the ambition had resulted in federal handcuffs, the parasite simply detached and sought a new host. Jordan was escorted back to his concrete cell. He sat on the rigid steel bench entirely alone, waiting for a randomly assigned public defender to explain how many decades he would spend inside a federal penitentiary. While Jordan was breaking down in general, holding a completely different dynamic was unfolding 2 floors above him. Vanessa was placed in a private, heavily monitored interrogation room. She was furious about the indignity of the arrest. She paced the length of the small room, demanding sparkling water and threatening to sue the federal agents for ruining her designer dress. Her arrogant facade cracked the moment the heavy steel door swung open. Her father had immediately dispatched his premier corporate litigator to the federal building. The attorney did not offer comfort. He walked into the room, placed a thick stack of printed documents on the metal table, and instructed Vanessa to sit down and remain completely silent. The lawyer had just finished a preliminary evidence review with the lead federal prosecutor. He pushed the printed transcripts across the table. Vanessa stared at the pages. They were the exact digital communication logs Elias Vance had extracted from her encrypted cloud storage. She read her own explicit text messages detailing her secretive affair with the corrupt commercial lending officer. She saw the undeniable time-stamped proof of her active encouragement to forge my signature on the real estate loan. The lawyer coldly informed her that the Federal Bureau of Investigation possessed her complete digital footprint. They knew about her hidden offshore accounts. They knew about her coordinated strategy to force Jordan into a federal crime and subsequently flee the country with the stolen capital. The elite attorney delivered the uncompromising legal reality. He stated that the federal government possessed an airtight, impenetrable case. A jury trial was completely out of the question. If she attempted to fight the charges, she would be facing a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in a maximum security women's penitentiary for severe elder financial abuse, wire fraud, and identity theft. The suffocating reality of her situation completely extinguished her arrogant outrage. Vanessa possessed absolutely zero loyalty to Jordan. He had failed to secure the $4 million payout. He had failed to lock me inside a psychiatric ward. He was no longer useful to her survival. Her mind instantly calculated the only remaining avenue of escape. Vanessa did not shed a single tear for her husband. She looked directly at her high-priced attorney and issued a ruthless, highly calculated directive. She instructed him to summon the lead federal prosecutor into the interrogation room immediately. She was prepared to execute the ultimate catastrophic betrayal. She offered to turn state's evidence on the spot. She promised to provide exhaustive sworn testimony detailing Jordan's entire criminal architecture. She would claim that Jordan was the sole abusive mastermind behind the operation. She would testify that he had manipulated her, coerced her into participating in the credit card fraud, and forced her to communicate with the corrupt banker against her will. She was fully prepared to hand the federal government the exact undeniable ammunition they needed to lock my son in a federal cage for the rest of his natural life. She demanded absolute, unconditional legal immunity in exchange for his permanent destruction. Jordan sat in the bleak, windowless interrogation room of the federal detention center. His initial shock had morphed into a desperate, frantic delusion. He had exhausted the last remaining fraction of his personal credit limit to retain a mid-tier defense attorney named Harrison. Harrison was a pragmatist, a man entirely accustomed to managing the damage of arrogant corporate criminals. Jordan aggressively paced the small concrete room, spinning an elaborate web of absolute lies. He vehemently denied any criminal intent. He painted himself as a deeply concerned, loving son who genuinely believed his father was suffering from severe cognitive decline. He claimed Vanessa was a manipulative sociopath who had engineered the entire financial conspiracy behind his back. He insisted that Dr. Keller had completely deceived him regarding the medical protocols. Jordan demanded a high-profile jury trial. He believed his natural charisma and his fabricated narrative of victimhood would effortlessly sway a sympathetic judge. He was fully prepared to lie under oath to secure his freedom. Harrison sat at the metal table writing notes on a yellow legal pad, his expression entirely unconvinced. The heavy steel door clicked open. The lead federal prosecutor stepped into the room. Attorney Gallagher walked quietly behind him, attending the meeting as the official legal representative of the victim. The prosecutor did not carry thick legal briefs or stacks of printed testimonies. He simply carried a sleek, encrypted laptop. He placed the machine squarely on the center of the metal table. He did not waste breath arguing with Jordan's pathetic fabrications. He simply opened the screen and executed a single command. The prosecutor explained that Elias Vance had continued his digital excavation long after the initial boardroom confrontation. Elias had breached the secure servers of Dr. Keller's private psychiatric clinic. He had uncovered a massive, highly classified blackmail operation. Keller was a deeply paranoid criminal. He had installed concealed high-definition micro-cameras in his own private office to secretly record every illicit transaction, ensuring he possessed leverage over his wealthy clients. Elias had extracted the exact video file of Jordan's preliminary consultation. Lawrence had legally surrendered this unassailable digital evidence directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The video began to play. The audio was crystal clear. Jordan froze. The color drained from his face as he watched his own high-definition image sitting across from the corrupt psychiatrist. The footage captured every single damning syllable. The room listened as Jordan explicitly stated that his father was completely lucid and possessed absolute mental clarity. They watched as Jordan complained about his failing tech startup and his desperate need for immediate liquid capital. They watched him reach into a leather satchel, pull out heavy stacks of $100 bills, and drop exactly $50,000 in cash onto the mahogany desk. The video displayed Jordan directly instructing the doctor to fabricate an aggressive, irreversible dementia diagnosis so he could forcefully seize control of the corporate charter and execute the Apex Freight transaction. It was the absolute, undeniable definition of premeditated federal conspiracy. Harrison closed his yellow legal pad. He placed his pen down and looked at his client with profound, undisguised disgust. The prosecutor snapped the laptop shut. He reached into his coat pocket and slid a single sheet of paper across the metal table. It was a finalized, non-negotiable plea agreement. Harrison turned to Jordan and delivered the crushing, inescapable reality of the situation. He stated flatly that a jury trial was completely impossible. The hidden camera footage obliterated every single defensive strategy. If Jordan attempted to fight the charges in open court, the federal prosecutor would introduce the video of Vanessa's sworn testimony and the forged commercial loan documents. Harrison informed him that a judge would not hesitate to hand down the maximum possible sentence. He pointed a rigid finger at the printed document resting on the table. He advised Jordan to sign the brutal plea deal, immediately forfeit all remaining assets, and accept 12 years in a federal penitentiary or face a mandatory minimum of 20 years behind maximum security bars. Jordan stared at the paper, his entire fabricated universe collapsing into absolute terrifying ruin. He picked up the pen with violently shaking hands and signed his life away. 6 weeks later, the final sentencing hearing convened in the primary chamber of the federal courthouse. The room was a massive, imposing fortress of polished oak and cold marble. The air was heavy, sterilized, and completely devoid of oxygen. I sat in the front row of the gallery. Attorney Gallagher sat silently beside me. We were present to witness the final administrative execution of the threat. The heavy wooden doors at the side of the courtroom swung open. The federal bailiffs escorted Jordan into the room. He wore a stiff, bright orange prison jumpsuit. Heavy steel chains bound his wrists and ankles, clanking loudly against the marble floor with every short, restricted step. The arrogant, untouchable tech entrepreneur was permanently gone. He looked completely malnourished, terrified, and utterly broken by the brutal reality of federal holding. He shuffled toward the defense table and sat down, keeping his hollow eyes fixed firmly on the wooden surface. Vanessa sat at a separate table across the aisle. She had successfully secured her immunity deal, trading her husband's freedom for her own physical liberty. However, her victory was entirely hollow. The federal asset forfeiture protocols had completely decimated her existence. The government had immediately seized the sprawling suburban mansion, the luxury imported vehicles, and every single bank account associated with the fraudulent corporate loans. Her father, Richard Sterling, had kept his ruthless promise. He had permanently cut her out of the family trust and completely disowned her. She was wearing a cheap, wrinkled dress purchased from a discount rack. Her designer jewelry and expensive makeup were gone. She possessed zero remaining capital zero social standing and zero future prospects. She had avoided a concrete prison cell, but she was serving a permanent life sentence of absolute, inescapable poverty. The federal judge entered the courtroom and took his seat at the elevated bench. He did not offer a long, sympathetic speech. He did not entertain any pathetic pleas for judicial leniency. He looked at Jordan with profound, unfiltered contempt. He stated that the sheer calculated malice required for a son to attempt to lock his sane father inside a psychiatric facility for temporary financial gain was abhorrent to the fundamental principles of human decency. He struck his wooden gavel against the sounding block. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot. The judge sentenced Jordan to 12 consecutive years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. He ordered massive, unrestricted financial restitution, ensuring that the federal government would seize every single dollar Jordan might ever earn in the future. He turned his attention to Vanessa. He sentenced her to 5 years of strict federal probation. He explicitly mandated that she report to a parole officer weekly and secure immediate minimum wage employment to begin paying off her enormous civil penalties. The gavel struck the block a final time, permanently sealing their respective fates. The federal bailiffs stepped forward and grabbed Jordan by the arms, hauling him to his feet to escort him to the heavily armored transport vehicle waiting outside. Jordan stopped walking. He turned his head and looked across the wooden railing directly at me. His eyes were wide red and brimming with desperate tears. He searched my face for a single ounce of forgiveness, a final shred of lingering paternal affection. He wanted a sign that I still considered him my son. I stared back at him. My expression was perfectly composed, my eyes as hard and unyielding as glacial ice. I felt absolutely nothing. The internal mechanism that once held a father's love had been permanently dismantled and replaced by the cold, ruthless logic of survival. I broke the eye contact, turned my back on the shackled prisoner, and walked out the heavy oak doors into the bright, freezing morning sunlight. The freezing morning air filled my lungs as I descended the granite steps of the federal courthouse. The heavy oak doors closed behind me, sealing the final chapter of a deeply exhausting war. I walked toward the secure parking garage with a steady, unhurried stride. The adrenaline that had fueled my meticulous counteroffensive over the past 2 months slowly began to recede, leaving behind a profound, crystalline clarity. I climbed into the cab of my Chevrolet pickup and gripped the leather steering wheel. I did not turn the key immediately. I sat in the quiet isolation of the vehicle and watched the city traffic move relentlessly forward. The corporate titans, the federal prosecutors, the desperate criminals, they were all continuing their frantic routines. My role in their world was officially concluded. I turned the ignition and drove away from the financial district for the last time. The drive back to my sprawling suburban estate felt entirely different today. The massive wrought iron gates parted silently to grant me entry. I parked the truck and walked up the stone pathway to the heavy mahogany front door. I stepped inside the grand foyer. The house was perfectly immaculate, maintained with rigorous precision, but the silence echoing off the vaulted ceilings was deafening. This estate had been constructed decades ago as a monument to family stability and enduring legacy. I had purchased this land with the first massive profits from my logistics empire. I had envisioned Holiday's grandchildren and generations of shared history filling these vast rooms. Now standing in the center of the foyer, I realized the house was merely a museum dedicated to a future that was entirely fabricated. Jordan's betrayal had fundamentally severed my connection to this physical space. It was a fortress built to protect a family that did not actually exist. I walked into my private study and sat down at the central security terminal. I picked up the landline and dialed Attorney Gallagher. I instructed him to initiate a total liquidation of my physical assets. I wanted the estate listed on the premium real estate market by the end of the week. I ordered the sale of the antique furniture, the luxury vehicles gathering dust in the secondary garage, and the extensive art collection my late wife and I had acquired over our 40-year marriage. Gallagher did not question the directive. He understood that the geography of the betrayal needed to be entirely abandoned. He immediately mobilized a team of elite estate brokers and liquidators. Within 14 days, the physical remnants of my former life were entirely dismantled. The estate sold to an international tech executive for a massive unnegotiated cash sum. The funds were instantly transferred into my secure portfolio. I packed 2 large canvas duffel bags containing my essential clothing, my financial ledgers, and a single silver-framed photograph of my late wife. I handed the keys to the estate broker and drove away without checking the rearview mirror. My financial empire required a permanent, secure restructuring. I traveled to the commercial headquarters of my independent logistics firm. I called Marcus Thorne into my office. Marcus was the man I had saved from corporate ruin decades ago, the same executive who had granted me invisible access to the Apex Freight boardroom. I promoted him to Chief Executive Officer, transferring absolute operational control of the federal shipping routes and the commercial fleet directly into his hands. I retained majority shareholder status, ensuring the corporate profits would continue to flow into my accounts, but I permanently removed myself from the daily warfare of the logistics industry. Marcus had earned the empire through decades of unwavering tested loyalty. He possessed the exact grit and integrity that my own son had entirely lacked. The massive influx of capital from the estate sale, combined with the ongoing corporate dividends, required a permanent destination. I refused to let the wealth stagnate in offshore accounts. I returned to Gallagher's office to draft a new irrevocable trust. I ordered the complete legal dissolution of Jordan's remaining inheritance pathways. I explicitly barred him from ever accessing a single cent of my portfolio, regardless of his future circumstances. I established a massive, heavily endowed financial foundation in my late wife's name. She had been a fiercely intelligent, compassionate woman who believed that true potential was often smothered by systemic poverty. We funneled the vast majority of my liquid wealth into a comprehensive scholarship fund. The charter was ruthlessly specific. The trust was designed exclusively for underprivileged Black youth seeking advanced degrees in logistics, civil engineering, and corporate finance. I wanted to actively fund the education of young men and women who were forced to fight and scrape for every single inch of ground they gained. I wanted to empower students who understood the absolute value of hard work, resilience, and unyielding discipline. I was permanently redirecting the unearned privilege Jordan had squandered toward the exact demographics that actually possessed the hunger to build a legitimate empire. Gallagher finalized the federal tax structures and the charitable designations. The foundation was legally fortified against any future civil challenges. The legacy of my wealth was now permanently insulated from toxic entitlement. It would operate as a silent, unstoppable engine of generational uplift. With the legal and financial architecture completely secured, I left the city. I drove north for 2 days, leaving the suffocating concrete grids and the frantic corporate arenas far behind. I crossed state lines until the landscape shifted into dense, towering pine forests and jagged, freezing coastlines. I arrived in a small, rugged coastal town in the Pacific Northwest. It was a working-class community populated by commercial fishermen, timber haulers, and people who respected absolute privacy. I purchased a sturdy, modest, cedar-shingled house perched on a high granite bluff overlooking the ocean. The property possessed no wrought iron gates, no massive security terminals, and no sweeping marble foyers. It had a heavy iron wood stove, thick insulated windows, and a wraparound wooden deck that faced the relentless crashing waves of the Pacific. My new routine was forged in absolute restorative silence. I woke up before dawn every morning. I brewed strong, bitter coffee in the quiet kitchen. I carried my mug out onto the wooden deck and watched the freezing fog roll off the dark ocean water. The rhythmic, violent crashing of the waves against the granite cliffs provided a constant grounding soundtrack to my existence. The ocean was entirely indifferent to corporate acquisitions, federal indictments, and familial betrayals. It simply existed, moving with undeniable ancient power. I spent my days chopping firewood, maintaining the property, and reading heavy historical biographies by the heat of the iron stove. The physical labor was deeply therapeutic. It kept my hands calloused and my mind sharp. Every month, Attorney Gallagher forwarded a heavily encrypted digital dossier containing the operational reports from the logistics firm and the financial summaries of the Scholarship Foundation. I read the letters from the first cohort of university students whose tuition, housing, and textbooks were entirely covered by my late wife's trust. Their words were filled with profound, genuine gratitude. They detailed their brutal academic schedules, their ambitious career plans, and their fierce determination to succeed against insurmountable odds. I filed their letters in a thick leather binder on my desk. They were building the legacy that my bloodline had failed to secure. I did not receive any communication from the federal penitentiary. Jordan was a ghost serving his sentence in total isolation, stripped of his arrogance and his stolen capital. Vanessa was a distant memory forced to navigate the punishing reality of minimum wage labor and strict federal probation. They had attempted to bury me alive to secure their own comfort. In response, I had legally and financially obliterated their entire world. I stood on the edge of the granite bluff as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the freezing sky in bruised shades of violet and gray. The bitter wind whipped across my face. I pulled the collar of my canvas coat tight against the cold. The war was definitively over. The battlefield was entirely silent. The justice I had engineered was absolute and irreversible. I turned my back to the darkening ocean, walked inside my sturdy, quiet house, and locked the door against the coming night. Peace had finally been restored. True family is not defined by shared bloodlines or inherited wealth. It is forged through mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and the shared capacity for genuine empathy. When entitlement corrupts the foundation of a home, the most profound act of self-preservation is walking away. Justice does not always require destruction. Sometimes it simply demands the complete redirection of resources toward those who actually possess the grit to utilize them properly. Protecting your peace is the ultimate victory. By stripping away toxic attachments, you create the necessary space to build a legacy that transcends personal betrayal and enriches the broader world forever. If you enjoyed this story of absolute justice and emotional closure, please like, subscribe, and share this narrative with anyone who appreciates the value of protecting their own peace. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on Lawrence's final decisions.